Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Snoozy Scientist, where we gently explore the mysteries of our world, one sleepy yawn at a time. Whether you're resting beneath warm blankets, drifting in the stillness of night, or floating through that quiet space where thoughts begin to blur, you are exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we're traveling to a forgotten Earth, a world that existed hundreds of millions of years before the first dinosaur ever took a step. Dinosaurs may feel ancient, but in truth, they were latecomers. They appeared only 230 million years ago, and yet for more than 3 billion years before that, life had already risen, collapsed, and reshaped the planet in ways so strange they almost defy imagination. Long before the reign of the dinosaurs, our planet belonged to creatures so strange, so astonishing, they make dinosaurs look almost ordinary. Imagine dragonflies with wings as wide as hawks, filling the skies with the low drone of enormous wings. Millipedes longer than cars, armored and unstoppable as they rippled across damp forest floors. These weren't the gentle insects we swat away today. They were monsters, filling the skies, crawling across the ground, and dominating ecosystems in ways we can scarcely imagine. Beneath the surface of ancient seas, armored fish patrolled with jaws powerful enough to crush bones, and predators with saw-blade mouths, alien forms that would look more at home in a nightmare than in nature. This was not the world we know, it was Earth in its forgotten ages. Familiar, yet alien, beautiful, yet terrifying, and it leaves us with haunting questions. What did our world truly look like before dinosaurs? Why did insects grow to the size of birds? What cataclysms wiped away entire kingdoms of life, long before dinosaurs ever appeared? And what can these forgotten ages teach us about survival on a fragile planet still in motion today? Tonight, we'll drift gently into that ancient world, through forests of giants, oceans of monsters, and skies alive with wings, to the lost ages that prepared the way for the reign of dinosaurs. But before we begin, if you enjoy journeys like this, soft, soothing, and quietly filled with wonder, I'd love it if you gave this video a gentle like and maybe tapped subscribe. It helps more curious minds like you find their way here and lets the algorithm know that sleep and science belong together. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments, where are you winding down from tonight? And what time is it there? It's always such a joy to see how far across the world this sleepy corner of science travels. Now take a deep breath, let your shoulders soften, and together, let's step softly into the forgotten world before the dinosaurs. Step into the Carboniferous world, more than 300 million years in the past, and the first thing to notice would be the air. It was heavy and humid, richer in oxygen than what we breathe today. Instead of the 21% that now fills our skies, oxygen made up close to 35% of the atmosphere. This single change transformed the planet into something almost unrecognizable. Creatures that are small and easily overlooked in our world grew into monsters, and the forests that spread across the land rose into vast, swampy cathedrals of green. These forests were unlike any that exist today. Towering club mosses, some as tall as 10 stories, crowded the land with thick trunks that split into crowns of branches near their tops. Tree ferns spread enormous fronds that draped over the forest floor like canopies, while giant horsetails formed dense clusters, their hollow stalks bristling with green needles. Flowers had not yet evolved, so there were no blossoms to brighten the shade, no birds to sing above, and no mammals to move among the undergrowth. Instead, the landscape was dominated by this ancient plant life, silent but imposing, locked in an endless cycle of growth, death, and decay. The ground beneath was soft and spongy, a living mat of fallen leaves and trunks that slowly sank into the swampy water. Each season added to the layers, and over millions of years, those beds of rotting vegetation would compress into the thick seams of coal that later fueled human industry. But in this moment of deep time, it was a living carpet, dark and moist, feeding a world that buzzed with giants. Above the forest, the skies belong to creatures that stretch our imagination. Enormous dragonflies, called meganura, glided through the humid air with wings that spanned more than 2 feet across, wider than many birds today. Their transparent wings caught the sunlight like panes of glass, flashing silver and green as they darted between the trees. These hunters relied on enormous compound eyes to spot prey, and once they locked onto a target, they swooped with precision. The constant hum of their wings filled the air, a droning chorus that must have been as unnerving as it was mesmerizing. On the ground and in the shadows, other giants lurked. Scorpions the size of housecats crept through the ferns, their pincers opening and closing with slow menace, their tails arched high, tipped with gleaming stingers. In the damp rot of fallen logs, centipedes longer than a human arm wriggled forward on dozens of legs, their bodies moving like living ripples of muscle and armor. Even beetles, cockroaches, and other insects that today fit in the palm of a hand grew into unsettling proportions, each one made possible by the oxygen-rich air that surrounded them. The science behind their size lies in the way insects breathe. Instead of lungs, they rely on a network of tiny tubes that allow oxygen to diffuse directly into their tissues. In our world, this system limits their size because oxygen cannot travel far enough through their bodies. But in the Carboniferous, the abundance of oxygen meant these creatures could grow far larger without suffocating. Air itself became the fuel for gigantism, and the result was a forest alive with monsters that seemed both familiar and alien. Imagine the canopy shifting above as giant dragonflies darted through beams of filtered light. Picture the forest floor trembling as scorpions and centipedes emerged from the shadows, their movements deliberate, their bodies gleaming in the haze. The Carboniferous forest was not quiet. It buzzed, rattled, and droned with the life of creatures whose sizes pushed the boundaries of what the natural world could sustain. Everywhere was motion, from the rippling of countless legs across damp logs to the shimmering arcs of wings overhead. The forest itself seemed restless, always humming, always alive with sound and movement. The sheer scale of it is difficult to grasp, for these were not just insects enlarged by imagination, but real animals that filled the land and sky, thriving in conditions that no longer exist. In this strange atmosphere, where plants grew into towers and insects into giants, the balance of life was unlike anything on Earth today. And hidden in the misty shadows of these forests, beneath the sweeping fronds and along the swampy ground, something even more immense moved with quiet confidence, a creature whose very presence made even the dragonflies seem small. Beneath the towering club mosses and tree ferns of the Carboniferous forest, where the ground was dark and soft with decaying vegetation, lived one of the most extraordinary creatures ever to walk on land. It was not a predator swooping from above, or a reptile lurking in the shadows. Instead, it was an invertebrate, a relative of today's millipedes, but stretched into a size that almost defies belief. This was Arthropleura, the largest land invertebrate ever discovered, a living fortress that crept slowly across the swampy ground. Arthropleura could grow up to 8 feet long, longer than most people are tall, and nearly as wide as a coffee table. Its body was segmented, each section covered in overlapping plates of armor that shone faintly in the humid light filtering through the trees. Unlike the smooth, harmless millipedes we might see today curling beneath a log, this creature moved with a sense of weight and inevitability, as if nothing in the forest could stop its progress. Hundreds of legs carried its armored frame, in waves of rippling motion, rising and falling in a rhythm that must have seemed both mesmerizing and unsettling. To encounter Arthropleura in its time would have been an unforgettable experience. Imagine standing on the damp ground as the ferns rustled, and then watching as something longer than your body slid past, its plates clinking softly against one another, its many legs pressing into the mud with a faint, steady patter. Bigger than a dog, stretched longer than a man, it was not a creature to be ignored. It did not need to hurry, because few things in the Carboniferous dared to threaten it. Fossil trackways discovered in Scotland give us rare glimpses into its life. Preserved in ancient sediments, they reveal the pattern of its limbs pressing into the soft ground, rows of prints marching forward in perfect order. Some trails stretch for meters, as though the creature had glided effortlessly across open spaces. Others curve or shift, showing moments where it turned, paused, or climbed over obstacles. These tracks are silent testimonies of its presence, left behind hundreds of millions of years ago and uncovered by chance in the modern world. To place your hand beside one of these fossilized marks is to measure yourself against the stride of a creature that reigned long before the first dinosaurs ever appeared. Despite its immense size and fearsome appearance, Arthropleura was likely not a predator. Evidence suggests it fed on plants, moss, and rotting vegetation, moving steadily through the forests like a living recycler. In doing so, it played a vital role in breaking down the endless carpet of organic matter that covered the swamp floor. By grinding through decaying leaves and fallen stems, it returned nutrients to the soil, supporting the very forests that towered above it. This balance between giant plants and giant detritivores created an ecosystem that thrived in ways both alien and strangely familiar. The presence of Arthropleura also reminds us how different Earth's atmosphere once was. Its massive body could only have existed in a world supercharged with oxygen. With every breath it drew through its simple air tubes, the Carboniferous atmosphere allowed it to sustain a size that would be impossible today. If it tried to live in our modern world, it would suffocate under its own weight, unable to draw in enough oxygen to survive. It was a creature sculpted by its time, and when those conditions changed, its reign quietly came to an end. Still, in its prime, Arthropleura must have been a sight that stirred both awe and fear. Its sheer scale would have made it a moving landmark of the forest floor, gliding between roots and across fallen trunks, its armored body gleaming with moisture. Other creatures, no matter how large, must have stepped aside, giving way to this unstoppable wave of armor and legs. The Carboniferous forests were filled with giants, but Arthropleura remains one of the most haunting. It was not swift or sleek, nor did it rely on teeth or claws. Instead, it ruled through its size, through its unshakable presence, through the fact that it was too large to be challenged. In its slow, deliberate crawl, it embodied the strange power of its world. As this armored giant threaded the fern shadows and the forest hummed with outsized wings, other hunters were taking shape in the same wet world. In the dim spaces between roots and pools, the Carboniferous swamps were about to reveal predators that did not fly and did not tower, yet struck with speed and precision from the ground itself. The forests of the Carboniferous were not just home to giants of the air and creatures that fed on plants. Beneath the heavy canopy, in the dim light that filtered through layers of towering ferns and club mosses, the shadows hid predators of unsettling size. This was not yet a world of dinosaurs, nor even reptiles at their peak. Instead, the role of hunter was filled by creatures that today might seem small or even harmless, yet in this ancient world had swollen into monsters. Scorpions were among the most striking of these predators. Some grew as large as housecats, creeping silently through the damp forest floor. Their bodies glistened in the moisture of the swamp, their pincers opening and closing with slow, deliberate precision. Each step of their jointed legs pressed lightly into the spongy ground as they advanced in search of prey. Their stingers, long and curved, gleamed faintly whenever shafts of sunlight managed to break through the dense canopy above. In this environment, they were formidable hunters, capable of seizing smaller animals or fending off rivals with a single venomous strike. Sharing the shadows were centipedes that stretched to unsettling lengths, arthropods related to the millipedes and centipedes of today. They could grow longer than a human arm, their bodies divided into many segments, each with a pair of sharp, scuttling legs. They moved in rippling waves, their bodies flowing like living currents across the forest floor. These hunters were fast and efficient, their flattened bodies slipping easily into the undergrowth, their powerful jaws ready to seize anything smaller that crossed their path. In the perpetual twilight of the swamp, they lurked among rotting logs and mats of moss, waiting to strike with sudden bursts of speed. The wetlands themselves offered a stage for predators of another kind, amphibians, some small and nimble, others enormous and heavily built, dominated the pools and sluggish streams that wound through the Carboniferous forests. Their bodies carried the memory of their fish ancestors, yet they had adapted to life where land and water met. Some were shaped like giant salamanders, their wide mouths lined with sharp teeth for snapping up fish and insects. Others grew to impressive sizes, their bodies strong enough to hold themselves on land while still tied to the waters where they bred and fed. These amphibians often lay in wait, half hidden at the edges of swamps, their eyes and nostrils barely above the surface, ready to lunge at whatever passed too close. Together, these predators created a landscape alive with motion. The air was thick with the drone of giant insects, but beneath that constant hum was the rustle of legs through damp foliage, the sudden splash of amphibians breaking the water's surface, the faint crack of a scorpion's pincer snapping shut. The Carboniferous forest was no quiet refuge. It was an environment where sound carried both warning and threat, and where every shadow might conceal something waiting to strike. What makes this world so haunting is how different it feels from what we know today. In modern forests, the top predators are mammals and birds, swift and intelligent hunters. In the Carboniferous, the balance was different. The giants of the air were insects, the lords of the ground were scorpions and centipedes, and the lurking dangers of the water were amphibians that had only just begun to claim land as their own. It was a world in which roles were unfamiliar, and the creatures we see as small or harmless today were instead the rulers of their ecosystems. The combination of high oxygen, dense vegetation, and endless swamps created the perfect stage for these predators. The air was heavy, the ground damp, and the forests alive with the endless cycle of life and death. Every movement, every sound, every flicker of motion carried the tension of survival, and it was within these forests, among the shadows and swarms, that the experiment of life pressed forward, shaping the future in ways both strange and profound. Amid this whom of activity, one truth lingered. The Carboniferous world was never still. It pulsed with risk and opportunity, and it begs a simple question that lives in the air itself. What made these bodies so large in the first place? The answer is not in tooth or claw, but in every breath, in the very chemistry of the sky. The Carboniferous world was filled with creatures that seem almost impossible when compared to the life around us today. Dragonflies with wings as wide as hawks, millipedes as long as cars, scorpions that crept through the shadows the size of housecats. These giants were not accidents, they were products of the very air that surrounded them. The secret to their size lay not in their muscles, nor in their armor, but in something invisible, something that touched every breath, every wing beat, every crawling step. It was oxygen, and in this forgotten age, it was everywhere in abundance. The atmosphere of the Carboniferous period contained nearly 35% oxygen, far more than the 21% we breathe now. This difference may sound modest, but its impact on life was profound. Oxygen is the fuel that powers the engines of biology. It is what cells use to break down sugars and release energy, what muscles depend upon to contract, and what nerves require to fire signals. In a world where oxygen saturated every breath of air, organisms could push their bodies beyond limits that are fixed today. The result was a landscape filled with giants, shaped not by imagination, but by chemistry. For insects and their relatives, known as arthropods, this change was especially important. Unlike mammals, reptiles, or birds, which use lungs to actively draw in air, arthropods breathe through a network of tiny tubes called tracheae. These tubes open to the outside through small holes in the body, letting oxygen diffuse directly into their tissues. In the world we live in now, this system places a strict limit on size. The larger the insect, the farther oxygen must travel, and diffusion alone cannot carry enough to fuel a body beyond a certain point. That is why the dragonflies we see today are small, why our millipedes curl easily into the palm of a hand, why the largest insects are delicate compared to vertebrates. But in the Carboniferous, the rules were different. With oxygen so plentiful, those same tracheal tubes could deliver fuel deep into the body. Every tissue, every muscle, every nerve could be saturated far more efficiently. The constraints of diffusion loosened, and insects expanded into forms that could not exist now. A dragonfly with a wingspan of 2 feet could power its flight because every beat of its wings was supported by an atmosphere dense with oxygen. A millipede 8 feet long could move steadily across the forest floor because each of its hundreds of legs was nourished with more oxygen than modern air could provide. In a way, the very air itself became the fuel for monsters. It filled the forests with possibilities, making even the most ordinary of creatures extraordinary. To walk through those swampy landscapes would have been to witness familiar shapes enlarged to impossible scale. The buzz of wings overhead was not from delicate insects, but from predators the size of birds. The rustle in the undergrowth came not from tiny beetles, but from centipedes longer than a child is tall. The air, thick with oxygen, was not just sustaining life, it was exaggerating it. This abundance of oxygen was not accidental, it was tied to the forests themselves. During the Carboniferous, vast expanses of club mosses, horsetails, and ferns spread across the continents. Their growth was unchecked, their roots binding the soil, their fronds capturing sunlight, and their tissues storing carbon in unprecedented amounts. When these plants died, they fell into the swampy ground, where waterlogged conditions slowed decay. Instead of returning carbon dioxide quickly to the atmosphere, it was buried and locked away. Oxygen levels climbed higher and higher, pushed upward by millions of years of plant growth and burial. The balance of gases in the air created a feedback loop. As oxygen rose, fire became more common, for even damp wood and vegetation could ignite more easily. Forests burned, clearing space for new growth, which in turn captured more carbon and released more oxygen. The cycle reinforced itself, driving oxygen levels to peaks never reached again in Earth's history. For the animals of the time, this was both a blessing and a challenge. Giants flourished, feeding on one another and filling every ecological niche. Yet higher oxygen also brought risks. Fires may have swept across the swamps more frequently, reshaping the landscapes again and again. Still, for millions of years, this balance held, and life thrived in exaggerated forms, sculpted by air that carried more fuel than our world could ever sustain today. When oxygen eventually fell back to levels closer to what we know, the age of insect giants ended. the atmosphere no longer supported their size, and the great millipedes and enormous dragonflies disappeared. But in their time, they revealed just how deeply the invisible chemistry of the air can shape the visible face of life. The Carboniferous forests had given rise to a world of giants, all born from air alone. And while these insects and millipedes ruled the land and the skies, the swamps themselves held other predators, creatures that were neither fish nor reptiles, but something in between, filling the wetlands with eyes and jaws that waited just beneath the surface. The Carboniferous forests, with their towering trees and air thick with oxygen, were alive not only with insects and arthropods that had grown to monstrous sizes. Beneath the canopy, in the swamps and still waters that pooled across the land, another group of creatures was beginning to dominate. They were the early amphibians, descendants of fish that had taken their first uncertain steps onto land millions of years before. By the Carboniferous, they had diversified into forms that ranged from small, salamander-like animals to massive predators that could stretch longer than a person. These amphibians filled roles that reptiles had not yet evolved to claim, and for a time, they were the rulers of the land. The swamps provided the perfect stage for their expansion. With shallow pools, muddy banks, and dense vegetation, the wetlands offered both food and shelter. Fish still thrived in the water, while insects and smaller vertebrates provided prey along the edges. Amphibians took advantage of both worlds, slipping easily between water and land. Some remained tied closely to ponds and rivers, hunting fish with quick lunges of their jaws. Others became more terrestrial, creeping through the undergrowth in search of insects or smaller amphibians. Their bodies reflected this in-between existence. They carried lungs for breathing air, but their skin remained moist and permeable, still requiring contact with water to survive. Among the most impressive of these creatures were the temnospondyls, a group of amphibians that included both small species and giants that grew to lengths of 15 feet. Their broad, flat heads, wide jaws, and toothy grins gave them an appearance both alien and familiar, like crocodiles that had not yet fully learned to live on land. Many lurked at the edges of swamps, their eyes just above the water, waiting for unsuspecting prey to pass within reach. With a sudden surge, they would lunge forward, clamping powerful jaws around fish, insects, or even smaller amphibians, dragging them beneath the surface in an ancient preview of ambush tactics still used by crocodiles today. Other amphibians were smaller and more agile, darting among the ferns and roots in search of insects. Some developed elongated bodies with many vertebrae, allowing them to wriggle through narrow spaces in the forest floor. These forms resembled the salamanders and caecilians of today, showing that amphibians were already experimenting with body plans that would persist for hundreds of millions of years. The sheer diversity of shapes and lifestyles reveals how successful they had become in these swampy ecosystems. For a time, amphibians were the dominant vertebrates on land. They occupied the role of top predators, filling niches that reptiles would later take over. Their size, strength, and adaptability allowed them to flourish in ways unmatched by their fish ancestors, but their dependence on water remained a limitation. Amphibian eggs were soft and fragile, needing to stay in moist environments to avoid drying out. This tied them to swamps, rivers, and wetlands, even as the forests stretched across entire continents. In this way, their dominance foreshadowed the coming rise of reptiles, which would evolve eggs capable of surviving in drier conditions and expand into territories beyond the reach of amphibians. Still, in the Carboniferous world, amphibians reigned supreme. Imagine the hush of a swamp at dusk, the air alive with the droning of insects, the water's surface broken only by the ripple of something massive shifting beneath. Then, without warning, a broad head rises slowly, eyes gleaming in the fading light. A giant temnospondyl waits in silence, muscles coiled for the strike. The forest floor trembles with the scuttling of insects, while smaller amphibians creep across the mud, seeking their own meals. The entire scene is alive with movement, each layer of the swampy ecosystem intertwined, each predator and prey shaping the balance of life. These amphibians remind us that the story of dominance on land did not begin with dinosaurs or even with reptiles. Long before those creatures rose to power, the Carboniferous forests were already home to vertebrates that had taken control of their world. They were the heirs of fish, the first animals with spines to claim land as their own, and their reign marked a critical chapter in the history of life. But even as they thrived, changes were stirring. The air that had allowed insects to grow enormous was beginning to shift, and the balance of the atmosphere was never stable for long. Their dominance tells a larger story, one that began long before these swamps. To understand how Earth assembled such rulers, we need to look back across hundreds of millions of years into seas where the first experiments in power and defense began. But how did Earth become a place of giants, where insects grew wider than birds and amphibians stretched longer than crocodiles? To understand that strange world, the story must be rewound, back through layers of time, to a chapter hundreds of millions of years earlier. Before the Carboniferous forests rose, before even the first plants reached skyward, life belonged almost entirely to the sea. And in those ancient waters, the world was filled with creatures so alien that even the strangest of the Carboniferous would seem familiar by comparison. It was the Cambrian period, more than 500 million years ago, and Earth's oceans looked nothing like the ones we know today. There were no fish with scales, no whales gliding through blue depths, no coral reefs stretching across the shallows. Instead, the seas were home to forms that seemed to defy logic, each one an experiment in the possibilities of life. The Cambrian seas were laboratories of evolution, filled with creatures trying out new ways to feed, move, and survive. The seafloor was alive with trilobites, scuttling in endless numbers. Their bodies were divided into 3 lobes, encased in hard exoskeletons, and their many legs carried them across the sand with ease. Some dug into the sediment to hide from predators, while others swam clumsily above the bottom. Their compound eyes, made from lenses of crystal, glimmered in the filtered sunlight that reached into the shallows. Trilobites would become some of the most successful animals in Earth's history, surviving for hundreds of millions of years, but here, in the Cambrian, they were only just beginning their long story. Among them lurked stranger shapes. Worm-like creatures wriggled across the mud, some with bristles that helped them burrow, others with jaws that snapped open and shut like traps. Spiny forms, resembling pincushions, grazed on tiny particles drifting in the water. Soft-bodied animals floated in the currents, some shaped like discs, others like ribbons or cones. Each seemed to test the limits of what life could become, filling the seas with diversity unlike anything that had come before. And then there were the predators, which made the Cambrian seas a dangerous place. One of the most formidable was Anomalocaris, the first great hunter in Earth's history. Growing up to 3 feet long, it dwarfed most other animals of its time. Its body rippled as it swam, propelled by rows of flexible lobes along its sides. 2 grasping arms extended from its head, curling inward to seize prey, and its circular mouth, lined with plates that rotated and crushed, devoured whatever it captured. Fossils reveal that its eyes were compound and immense, with tens of thousands of lenses, making its vision sharper than almost any other creature alive at the time. In a world of small, slow animals, Anomalocaris was an unstoppable force. The Cambrian seas were a theater of innovation, where survival often meant trying something entirely new. For the first time in Earth's history, animals evolved hard parts like shells, spines, and armor, giving them protection against the rising tide of predators. Burrowing into the sand became a strategy, hiding within the sediment to escape those sharp eyes above. Others adapted by becoming faster, more flexible, or more sensitive to vibrations in the water. It was a race between predator and prey, and the pace of evolution itself seemed to accelerate. This explosion of life, often called the Cambrian explosion, transformed the planet forever. In a relatively short window of geological time, most of the major body plans that exist today first appeared. From simple beginnings, creatures developed structures that would eventually become legs, jaws, eyes, and backbones. The ancestors of nearly every modern animal group trace their roots to these alien seas. To picture it is to imagine an ocean filled with forms that seem part dream, part nightmare. Trilobites crawling like armored beetles across the seafloor, worm-like creatures sprouting spines or tentacles, soft-bodied swimmers drifting like ribbons in the current, and predators with grasping arms and circling mouths patrolling the water column. It was not a world of balance yet, but a world of experimentation, where life was feeling its way forward, testing possibilities, discarding some, and perfecting others. These Cambrian seas may appear alien to us, but they hold the foundation of everything that followed. The armored fish of the Devonian, the giant insects of the Carboniferous, even the dinosaurs that would one day thunder across the land, all owe their origins to this first great burst of creativity. And as these oceans swelled with strange forms, one creature in particular began to shape the story of life as predator and prey collided in new and powerful ways, setting the stage for the rise of the first true super-predators of Earth's history. In the alien seas of the Cambrian, where life was still experimenting with shapes and strategies, one creature rose to a level of power that none had achieved before. It was Anomalocaris, whose very name means strange shrimp, though it was far more fearsome than that description suggests. Stretching up to 3 feet in length, it was a giant in a world where most animals were no larger than your hand. In oceans filled with tiny swimmers and crawling trilobites, Anomalocaris loomed like a shadow, a predator that transformed the rules of survival. Its body was long and flexible, built for speed and control in the water. Along each side ran a series of flaps that rippled in waves, propelling it forward with a motion not unlike a manta ray gliding through modern seas. This gave Anomalocaris an agility its prey could not match, allowing it to move with fluid precision as it patrolled the water column. At the front of its body, extending like a pair of claws, were its most distinctive weapons, 2 hooked arms lined with spines. These appendages could sweep outward in a graceful arc, then snap inward to grasp and pin struggling prey. Once caught, the victim had little chance of escape. The prize was drawn toward its mouth, which was as unusual as it was terrifying. Shaped like a circular ring, it was lined with hardened plates that rotated and crushed together like gears. Some early scientists mistook the mouth for a jellyfish fossil, unable at first to imagine such a structure belonging to a single predator. But when pieced together, the design became clear. Anomalocaris could seize prey with its arms and feed it into this crushing ring where the plates broke down shells and soft tissue alike. No other animal of its time possessed such a coordinated arsenal. Its eyes added to its dominance. Fossils reveal that Anomalocaris had enormous compound eyes, each with tens of thousands of individual lenses. In an age when vision was still a rare and powerful innovation, these eyes gave it an advantage beyond measure. Where many of its prey relied on touch or chemical signals to sense the world, Anomalocaris could see with clarity. Shapes, movement, and even fine details were visible to it in the watery light of the Cambrian seas. With eyesight sharper than nearly anything else alive, it became the perfect hunter, able to detect prey from a distance and close in before it even sensed danger. For nearly 20 million years, Anomalocaris ruled the oceans as their apex predator. Trilobites, which scuttled across the seafloor in vast numbers, often bore the scars of its attacks. Fossilized shells sometimes show semicircular bites, the marks of its crushing mouth trying to pierce through their exoskeletons. It may not always have succeeded, but the evidence of its attempts is frozen in stone, reminders of the predator-prey arms race that was just beginning to shape the future of life. What makes Anomalocaris so remarkable is not only its appearance, but its place in the story of evolution. It represents one of the first times that Earth saw a creature become a true superpredator, combining speed, vision, weaponry, and strength. It was not a specialist bound to one niche, but a versatile hunter that dominated multiple layers of the food web. In many ways, it set the stage for all predators that followed, from armored fish to reptiles, and eventually to the great carnivorous dinosaurs that would arrive hundreds of millions of years later. The Cambrian seas, already filled with alien experiments in form, were reshaped by its presence. Smaller creatures adapted to burrow deeper, to move faster, to protect themselves with armor, or to evolve in ways that gave them even the slightest chance of survival. Anomalocaris forced life itself to adapt. Its dominance ensured that the evolutionary arms race would never slow again. And yet, like all rulers of Earth's history, its time eventually passed. Changing environments, competition, and the steady march of evolution brought new predators that took its place. But for a span of 20 million years, Anomalocaris was unrivaled, gliding through the waters with hooked arms outstretched, eyes scanning for movement, and a mouth that could grind through whatever it captured. Its reign was only one chapter in the long saga of the seas, but it left behind more than fossils. It left the template for predation itself. And as it glided through the Cambrian oceans, other creatures were already adapting in different ways, exploring shapes and strategies that would carry them far beyond its time, ensuring that the diversity of life would continue to expand in directions even stranger than this first great hunter could ever have imagined. Long before the rise of giant insects, before forests climbed into the sky, and even before the first vertebrates claimed the land, the seas were ruled by creatures that seemed small but were among the most enduring animals to ever live. They were the trilobites, and for hundreds of millions of years they scuttled, burrowed, and swam through Earth's oceans in astonishing numbers. To speak of the Cambrian seas is to speak of trilobites, for they were not just part of the landscape, they defined it. Trilobites were arthropods, relatives of insects, crabs, and spiders, but their appearance was distinct. Their bodies were divided into three main sections, which gave them their name. Trilobite simply means three-lobed. A hard exoskeleton covered their segmented forms, offering both protection and support. Many species had spines that lined their backs like rows of armor, while others were smooth and streamlined, shaped for gliding through the water. Some were as small as a fingernail, while others grew to lengths of more than 2 feet, dominating the seafloor with their armored bulk. One of the most remarkable features of trilobites was their eyes. Unlike the soft, light-sensitive organs of earlier creatures, Trilobite eyes were made of calcite crystal, the same mineral that forms limestone. These eyes were hard, durable, and uniquely suited for vision in underwater environments. Each eye was composed of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of tiny lenses, giving trilobites a compound view of the world around them. In some species, the eyes bulged outward like periscopes, allowing them to peer above the sediment while remaining safely buried. In others, the eyes were mounted high on stalks, swiveling to watch for predators from every direction. These crystal eyes were not only functional but are preserved in extraordinary detail in fossils, giving scientists a window into vision as it existed more than 500 million years ago. Their diversity was staggering. Some trilobites were hunters, creeping across the seabed in search of worms or smaller animals to crush with their spiny legs. Others were filter feeders, sweeping the water with delicate appendages to collect tiny particles. Many were scavengers, crawling patiently over the ocean floor to pick clean the remains of dead creatures. Their body plans were so versatile that they radiated into thousands of species, filling nearly every ecological role available to them. For hundreds of millions of years, trilobites were everywhere. Fossil beds reveal just how abundant they were. In places like Canada's Burgess Shale or the cliffs of Morocco, slabs of rock are crowded with their imprints, sometimes dozens pressed together as if frozen in motion. Some fossils capture moments of behavior, like trilobites molting out of their old shells, leaving behind hollow casings that look like empty ghosts. Others reveal long trails in the sediment, the trackways of trilobites as they crawled across the seafloor in search of food. These fossils have become more than scientific evidence. They are markers of geological time, so reliable and widespread that paleontologists use them to identify the age of rock layers across the world. The trilobites' long and varied history makes them guides to Earth's past, their presence a signature of when and where ancient seas once spread. Yet perhaps their most enduring legacy is survival. Trilobites first appeared in the Cambrian period, more than 500 million years ago, and they endured through cataclysm after cataclysm. They survived multiple mass extinctions, climate shifts, and the rise and fall of predators. For nearly 300 million years, they adapted again and again, shrinking, growing, changing form, but always finding a way to persist. In that resilience, they became Earth's first great survivors, a lineage that reminds us of life's persistence, even in the face of upheaval. To imagine the Cambrian Ocean is to imagine a world alive with trilobites. Armored bodies crawling across the seafloor like living shields, crystal eyes glinting in the dim light, legs scuttling in countless directions, and trails etched into the soft mud that still speak to us through stone. They were both ordinary and extraordinary, abundant yet remarkable, and their story threads through deep time like a constant presence. But the oceans did not remain theirs alone. As trilobites spread across the seafloor, other creatures were experimenting with new ways of life. Fins were forming, jaws were evolving, and vertebrates were beginning their long rise. Soon, fish would change the balance of the seas, and the age of trilobites would share its stage with animals built on entirely new designs. As trilobites scuttled across the seafloor and soft-bodied creatures drifted in the currents, the oceans themselves were preparing for a new kind of hunter. It was during the Devonian period, often called the Age of Fishes, that one of the most dramatic revolutions in the history of life unfolded. For the first time, vertebrates developed true jaws and teeth, and with them came a wave of armored predators that changed the seas forever. Among these new rulers were the placoderms, fish encased in plates of bone that covered their heads and shoulders like helmets. They were not delicate or graceful swimmers, but heavy, solid, and built for strength. Their bodies tapered into tails that propelled them forward with sudden bursts of speed, but it was their heads that drew the most attention. The bone plates formed natural armor, protecting them from attack and giving them an appearance almost mechanical in its design. Some were small, living quietly along the seafloor, but others grew to enormous sizes, and none more fearsome than Dunkleosteus. Dunkleosteus was a monster of its time, stretching over 20 feet in length and weighing more than a ton. Its head was sheathed in thick bone plates, giving it the look of a living tank. But the most terrifying feature was its mouth. Instead of teeth in the way we know them today, Dunkleosteus had sharp, bony plates that formed cutting edges. These plates acted like enormous shears, snapping together with tremendous force, capable of slicing through flesh and even the armor of other placoderms. When its jaws closed, the bite was one of the most powerful of any animal that ever lived, strong enough to crush bone in an instant. The evolution of jaws and teeth marked a turning point in Earth's history. Until the Devonian, most vertebrates fed by filter feeding or sucking small prey into their mouths. With jaws came the ability to bite, grip, and tear. This opened new possibilities for both predators and prey. Fish could now eat larger and tougher organisms, leading to more complex food webs. Prey had to adapt by developing defenses, from tougher armor to faster swimming. Evolution accelerated in a new arms race, shaping the diversity of life in ways that would echo for hundreds of millions of years. The seas of the Devonian became battlefields of innovation. Placoderms of every shape filled the oceans, from small bottom dwellers scraping at algae to massive hunters like Dunkleosteus. Fossils reveal the variety of forms, some with flattened bodies for resting on the seafloor, others with elongated snouts for probing into crevices, and still others streamlined for chasing prey through open water. They were the first vertebrates to dominate the oceans, and they did so with astonishing success. Imagine these waters not as gentle reefs, but as arenas of armored monsters. A Dunkleosteus charges forward, its heavy head plates gleaming in the filtered sunlight, jaws snapping with enough force to shatter its prey. Smaller placoderms dart to the side, their own armor clashing as they flee. Trilobites scuttle for cover among the rocks, but even their calcite shells offer little protection from jaws strong enough to crush through bone and stone alike. The ocean is alive with movement, a constant struggle between armored giants where survival depends on strength, speed, or cunning. But the rise of jaws did not only create hunters, it also spurred the evolution of the first true teeth, tiny structures embedded in the mouths of early fish. These teeth, simple at first, allowed for even greater efficiency in cutting and processing food. Over time, they became sharper, more specialized, and more numerous. From this moment onward, nearly every predator on Earth would owe its existence to this single innovation. The teeth in our own mouths trace their ancestry back to the Devonian seas, where placoderms first tested the design. For millions of years, placoderms ruled. Their armored forms spread across shallow seas and rivers, leaving behind fossils in stone layers across the world. Yet, like so many rulers, their dominance was not eternal. By the end of the Devonian, they began to disappear, victims of changing climates and the shifting balance of life. But their impact was permanent. They were the first armored giants to truly bite, and in doing so, they reshaped the oceans. The Devonian seas had birthed monsters like Dunkleosteus, predators that showed what was possible once jaws and teeth emerged. And as their era waned, other fish were already waiting in the shadows, sleeker and faster, preparing to carry the legacy of Jaws into the future. From the armored hunters of the Devonian, the story of vertebrates was only just beginning, and the next step would lead life out of the water and onto the land itself. The Devonian seas were filled with armored hunters, from placoderms with bone-crushing jaws to smaller fish darting through coral-like reefs. But not all of the story of life was happening beneath the waves. Along the edges of swamps, deltas, and shallow rivers, a quiet revolution was unfolding. It was here, in the margins where water met land, that some creatures began to experiment with a new way of living. For the first time, vertebrates dared to leave the safety of the ocean and explore the strange and uncertain world of the shore. One of the most remarkable of these pioneers was Tiktaalik, sometimes called the fishapod because it carried traits of both fish and amphibians. Discovered in rocks more than 375 million years old, Tiktaalik offers a rare glimpse into the transition from water to land. Its body was still clearly fish-like, with scales covering its skin and gills to breathe underwater, but it also carried features that hinted at the land dwellers to come. Its head was flattened like a crocodile's, with eyes set high on top, allowing it to watch the world above the surface while its body remained hidden below. Its ribs were strong, able to support its chest when it lifted itself out of the water, and most importantly, its fins were unlike those of any fish before it. The fins of Tiktaalik contained bones that resemble the shoulder, elbow, and wrist of modern tetrapods, the four-limbed vertebrates that would later include amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. With these fins, Tiktaalik could do more than swim. It could push itself up in shallow water, prop itself against the muddy ground, and even drag its body forward for short distances. Though it was not yet walking in the way later creatures would, it was testing the first awkward movements that would one day become strides. What drove Tiktaalik and its relatives to the edges of land remains a subject of study, but shallow environments, such as mudflats and river deltas, may have provided both opportunity and necessity. These waters were often unstable, drying into pools during droughts or shifting with the tides. Fish trapped in such places needed ways to survive when oxygen in the water ran low. Tiktaalik possessed lungs in addition to gills, allowing it to gulp air at the surface. This dual system meant it could live through conditions that would suffocate other fish. The combination of lungs and strong fins gave it an advantage in a changing world, and in that advantage lay the foundation for all terrestrial vertebrates to come. To imagine Tiktaalik is to picture a creature resting at the edge of a swamp, its flat head lifted above the water, its body half submerged in mud. With a sudden push of its fins, it could haul itself onto a damp sandbar, where it lay panting in the humid air, gulping oxygen through primitive lungs. Perhaps it stayed only briefly, before slipping back into the safety of the water, but each attempt brought it closer to life on land. These first movements were not graceful, but they were historic, the tentative steps of vertebrates toward a new frontier. The emotional weight of this moment is profound. Tiktaalik and creatures like it were the first to dare what none before had attempted: to breathe air, to lift their weight on limbs, to cross the boundary between water and land. Their steps were clumsy, their bodies still tied to the water, but their experiment changed the course of life forever. From their awkward movements would eventually come the strides of dinosaurs, the leaps of mammals, and the steps of humans. Fossils of Tiktaalik found in the Canadian Arctic reveal these details with striking clarity. The rocks there once formed part of an ancient delta, a landscape of shifting rivers and floodplains where such experiments in movement were possible. Preserved in stone are the flattened skulls, rib cages, and fin bones of creatures that lived in this liminal space, proof of the bridge between ocean and land. Each fossil is a snapshot of that transition, a frozen record of the first creatures that dared to breathe air and push themselves across mud. The Devonian shorelines must have been haunting places. Dragonflies and millipedes had not yet claimed the forests that would rise later, and the land itself was quiet, dotted with low plants and strange fungi. Into this stillness came Tiktaalik, dragging its armored body forward, leaving behind faint impressions in the mud. Those prints may have vanished with the next tide, but the path they symbolized remained open. Once vertebrates had taken those first breaths of air, they would never relinquish their claim to land again. The world was beginning to change. Insects would soon follow, plants would grow taller, and amphibians would diversify into swamps and rivers. But it began with these pioneers, fish that tested their fins against the earth, teaching themselves to rise, to crawl, and eventually to walk. The first creatures to crawl from water onto land did not emerge into the world as we know it today. There were no flowering plants, no grasses bending in the wind, no forests of pine and oak stretching across continents. Instead, the land was still raw and barren in many places, marked by rocky outcrops, mudflats, and low mats of moss and early plants. Yet during the Devonian period, something extraordinary began to unfold. The face of the continents started to change as the first true forests rose toward the sky. These forests were unlike anything we would recognize now. They were made not of familiar trees, but of strange giants that belonged to lineages long extinct. Towering club mosses, some reaching heights of over 100 feet, grew with trunks as thick as pillars. Their bark-like surfaces supported tall crowns of narrow leaves that spread outward at their tips, like living towers topped with green fans. Around them, giant horsetails clustered, their hollow stalks rising like scaffolding, bristling with slender leaves in segmented patterns. Tree ferns joined them, spreading vast fronds that arched overhead, casting shade across the damp earth below. Together, these plants transformed the land into a new kind of world, one where vertical space mattered for the first time. Until this point, most plants had stayed low to the ground, hugging the soil in mats or creeping stems. Now, with trunks that could support enormous heights, plants competed for sunlight by rising above one another. The land became three-dimensional, with towering canopies intercepting the sunlight and dense undergrowth filling the shadowed floors beneath. The roots of these plants reached deep into the soil, and their presence changed the land in profound ways. Roots broke apart rock and bound soil in place, preventing it from washing away. As they decayed, they released nutrients, enriching the ground for more plants to grow. Their fallen trunks and leaves piled into thick mats that built the foundation of future swamps. Most importantly, these forests began to reshape the atmosphere itself. Through photosynthesis, they pulled vast amounts of carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen back into the atmosphere. Over millions of years, this relentless process tipped the balance of gases, driving oxygen levels higher than they had ever been before. The transformation was slow on human scales, but immense across geological time. Where once there had been barren shores, there were now dense forests stretching for miles. Their roots filtered into riverbanks, stabilizing channels and changing the flow of water. Swamps spread across lowlands, fed by the endless litter of vegetation. As the forests expanded, they captured and buried massive amounts of carbon in the form of dead plant matter. Layer upon layer of this organic material sank into the earth, where it would eventually become the vast coal deposits that humans would uncover hundreds of millions of years later. For the creatures of this time, the rise of forests created new opportunities and new challenges. The shade provided shelter for amphibians creeping from the water, and the dense litter offered hiding places for insects that were already beginning to grow larger in the oxygen-rich air. The canopy created vertical habitats, allowing different organisms to find niches at different heights. At the same time, the dense forests darkened the land and filled the air with humidity, creating an environment unlike any before it. Imagine standing in one of these ancient forests. The trunks of club mosses rise like towers into the mist, their crowns spreading high above. Horsetails cluster like bamboo groves, their stalks hissing softly as wind moves through them. The fronds of tree ferns unfurl in vast spirals, shading the forest floor in deep green light. Underfoot, the ground is soft and damp, carpeted with layers of decaying plant matter. The air is heavy, rich with moisture, and thick with oxygen, a world being shaped breath by breath, leaf by leaf. These forests were more than landscapes. They were engines of planetary change. By drawing carbon from the air and storing it in the earth, they cooled the global climate. By releasing oxygen, they created conditions that allowed insects and amphibians to grow larger than they ever could today. They prepared the stage for the Carboniferous period that followed, a time when swamps would dominate the continents and giants would roam both land and sky. The rise of forests was not only the greening of the continents, but also the beginning of a cascade of changes that would ripple through Earth's history. As these towering plants spread, they reshaped the air, the soil, the rivers, and the very balance of life itself. And within the humid shadows of these new forests, creatures that had once belonged only to water were beginning to explore the opportunities that dry land offered, setting the stage for new experiments in survival. The ancient forests of club mosses, horsetails, and tree ferns reshaped the land into humid, shaded swamps. Their roots thickened the soil, their fallen trunks formed mats of damp litter, and their crowns wove a canopy that dimmed the sunlight. This new world, heavy with oxygen and alive with insects, offered food and shelter to many creatures, yet it also brought danger. The wetlands, though lush and inviting, became hunting grounds for a new kind of predator, amphibians that had grown into giants. These were not the small frogs and salamanders of today. Many were massive, crocodile-like creatures that could stretch more than 15 feet in length. Their bodies were broad and muscular, their limbs strong enough to push them across mud and shallow water, and their heads wide and flat with jaws lined in sharp teeth. Unlike their fish ancestors, these amphibians were not confined to rivers and lakes. They could crawl onto the forest floor, waiting silently in the shade until the moment came to strike. Their hunting style was one of patience and sudden violence. They lurked half-submerged at the edges of swamps, their eyes and nostrils peeking just above the surface. From this position, they could remain almost invisible, their mottled skin blending with water and vegetation. Smaller animals, insects, or even young amphibians that wandered too close would have no warning. In a single burst of movement, the giant predator would lunge forward, jaws snapping shut with immense force. Prey was dragged into the water, crushed between powerful jaws, and swallowed whole. The resemblance to modern crocodiles is striking, but these hunters lived long before reptiles ever evolved. They were among the first vertebrates to dominate ecosystems on land, filling niches that would later be taken over by reptiles and mammals. In their time, however, amphibians were at the top of the food chain, and their reign made the swamps dangerous places for anything smaller. Some of the most formidable belong to the group called temnospondyls. Their fossils reveal creatures with skulls, broad and heavy, some almost triangular in shape, with rows of sharp teeth capable of gripping slippery prey. They were built for ambush, their limbs short but strong, their tails long and muscular to help propel them in water. They thrived in rivers, lakes, and wetlands, and their remains have been found across continents, showing how widespread they became during their rule. For smaller creatures of the Carboniferous, survival was a constant challenge. The swamps swarmed with giant insects, but many of them fell victim to the amphibians waiting below. Even other amphibians were not safe, as the larger species preyed on the smaller. The wetlands became arenas of predation, where every ripple on the water's surface might mean a hidden jaw ready to snap. Land was not yet a refuge. For millions of years, it remained an extension of the swamp, a place where the boundaries between water and earth blurred and predators dominated both. These amphibians carried with them features that spoke of their dual heritage. Their lungs allowed them to breathe air, but their skin remained moist, making them forever tied to watery environments. Their eggs were soft, unable to survive outside of damp conditions, so even as they claimed land as their hunting ground, their lives were still bound to the swamps. It was both a strength and a limitation, allowing them to thrive in wetlands, but preventing them from spreading into drier regions. The sheer size of some of these amphibians must have been terrifying to witness. Imagine walking through the shadow of towering ferns, hearing the faint splash of something heavy moving just beneath the surface. A wide, flat head rises slowly from the water, eyes glinting in the dim light, nostrils flaring as it draws a breath. Then, in an instant, the stillness breaks. The water churns, the mud shifts, and jaws lined with teeth close around a struggling victim. The swamp falls quiet again, as if nothing had happened, the predator once more vanishing into the still water. For millions of years, amphibians reigned as the apex predators of the Carboniferous world. Their dominance reminds us that the story of life on land did not begin with reptiles or dinosaurs, but with these strange giants that blended features of fish and land dwellers. They were rulers of a transitional world, one that was neither fully aquatic nor fully terrestrial, but something in between. While these hunters held the wetlands, quieter revolutions were unfolding in the plants around them. A new way to persist and spread was taking root, and it would change where forests could live and who could follow them. As giant amphibians prowled the swamps and insects droned through the heavy air, an even quieter transformation was taking place in the world of plants. For millions of years, the forests had been built from club mosses, horsetails, and tree ferns, their towering trunks filling the land with dense green cathedrals. These plants had thrived in the waterlogged soils of the Carboniferous, where constant moisture allowed them to spread and reproduce. Yet the earth was not destined to remain covered only in swamps. Conditions began to change, and with them, plants discovered a new strategy that would reshape the continents forever. It was the evolution of the seed, a small package that carried within it not just the potential for new life, but also the tools to survive in harsher conditions. Earlier plants relied on spores, tiny dust-like particles that scattered into the air or water. Spores could spread widely, but they were fragile. Without water, they dried out quickly, and only a fraction ever grew into new plants. Seeds, by contrast, were encased in protective coats, shielding the delicate embryo inside. They carried food reserves as well, giving the young plant a head start once it began to grow. This simple innovation was a turning point in the history of life on land. The first true seed-bearing plants were gymnosperms, ancestors of the conifers, cycads, and ginkgos that would later dominate vast stretches of the planet. Unlike the swamp-loving ferns and mosses, gymnosperms were adapted to drier conditions. Their seeds could rest in the soil, waiting until conditions were favorable. Their roots dug deep, anchoring them in place and reaching water that shallow-rooted plants could not. Their leaves were often narrow and tough, able to withstand wind and conserve moisture. Together, these traits allowed gymnosperms to colonize environments where earlier plants could not survive. The rise of seeds marked a critical shift in the story of Earth. Swampy forests of the Carboniferous had flourished in places heavy with water, their reproduction tied to damp soil and wet conditions. But seeds freed plants from this dependence. With seeds, plants could spread across uplands, hillsides, and drier plains. Life was no longer confined to wetlands and deltas. The continents were opening up to forests of a new kind. The gymnosperms grew taller and sturdier than many of their predecessors. Conifer-like trees lifted their trunks into the air, their branches stretching outward in patterns that shaped the first true woodlands. These trees no longer needed to shed entire trunks and collapse into the swamp to reproduce. Instead, they released seeds that could drift on wind or fall into soil far from the parent tree. The world was no longer just green, it was dynamic, with forests expanding into new territories, creating mosaics of swamp, upland, and woodland. This transformation also changed the animals that lived alongside them. Insects adapted to feed on seeds and pollen, experimenting with new diets that spores could never have provided. Amphibians still reigned in the wetlands, but reptiles were beginning to emerge, and they too benefited from the forests shifting toward drier habitat. With gymnosperms came ecosystems less tied to water, and creatures that could survive without returning to the swamp had more opportunities to spread. The impact of seeds was not immediate but gradual, unfolding over millions of years, yet with every generation, the resilience of gymnosperms carved new possibilities into the landscape. In the shadow of ferns and mosses, their roots strengthened the soil, their trunks reached into the sky, and their seeds waited patiently, able to survive droughts and harsh seasons that would have destroyed more fragile plants. The earth was preparing for a new chapter, one in which forests would stretch across entire continents, creating stable habitats that could endure changes in climate. Imagine standing at the edge of such a world. Behind you, the swamps hum with dragonflies, scorpions, and amphibians lurking in shallow pools. Before you, the land begins to rise, drier, rockier, yet dotted with conifers that pierce the air with tall, narrow crowns. Beneath your feet, seeds lie hidden in the soil, tiny vessels carrying the promise of forests yet to come. Each seed holds a future, waiting for the right moment to unfold. The invention of seeds was more than a new way to reproduce. It was a survival strategy that allowed plants to endure in times of change, to wait out the harsh seasons, to spread into new lands, and to prepare the ground for all the life that would follow. Beneath these new canopies, the continents themselves were on the move, their slow collisions gathering strength far below root and soil. As the landmasses drew together, winds and waters would be rearranged, and the ground under every forest would change. The rise of seed-bearing plants had given life new opportunities on land, allowing forests to expand into places where ferns and mosses could not survive. Yet while plants were experimenting with new strategies above ground, deep beneath the surface, the earth itself was moving in ways that would alter everything. The continents, restless and unanchored, were drifting slowly across the globe, pushed and pulled by forces too vast to see, yet powerful enough to redraw oceans and crush mountains. Over millions of years, they inched closer together until the world's landmasses collided to form a single supercontinent. This supercontinent was Pangaea, and it was unlike anything the planet had seen in hundreds of millions of years. Stretching from pole to pole, it brought together almost all the land on Earth into one enormous mass. Vast coastlines curled around endless interior plains. The oceans that had once separated continents shrank into smaller basins, while one giant ocean, Panthalassa, wrapped around nearly the entire globe. From high above, the Earth would have looked starkly different, its face marked by one massive continent surrounded by endless sea. The collision that formed Pangaea was not gentle. As continents pressed into each other, their crust buckled and folded, raising mountain ranges that rivaled the Himalayas of today. Volcanoes flared as molten rock forced its way to the surface, and earthquakes rippled through the seams where land met land. The slow motion of tectonic plates, imperceptible to the creatures living above them, shaped a planet where coastlines shifted, swamps dried, and climates changed in ways that altered the course of evolution. For the lush forests and wetlands that had flourished in the Carboniferous, the rise of Pangaea brought hardship. Swamps that had stretched across continents began to shrink as climate patterns changed. Where once water had pooled in lowlands, vast deserts began to spread, driven by dry air currents that swept across the interiors of the continent. The heart of Pangaea was so far from the sea that rainfall could not reach it. Instead of humid swamps buzzing with dragonflies and echoing with the calls of amphibians, the land became barren, covered in endless stretches of sand and rock. This change was more than a shift in scenery. It was a transformation of the conditions that life depended upon. Amphibians, which had thrived in waterlogged forests, found fewer and fewer habitats that could support them. Their soft eggs, tied forever to water, limited them to shrinking wetlands. In contrast, reptiles, with their hard-shelled amniotic eggs, began to spread into the drier lands, taking advantage of niches that amphibians could not reach. The forests of gymnosperms, with their seeds built to survive harsher conditions, flourished where swamps receded, their roots gripping dry soils and their trunks forming the backbone of new ecosystems. The climate itself swung between extremes. Monsoons lashed the coastal regions, while the continental interiors baked under relentless heat by day and chilled under icy nights. Deserts sprawled across thousands of miles, broken only by pockets of green near rivers and oases. Fossil evidence reveals ancient dune fields stretching as far as the eye could see, their rippled surfaces frozen in stone. In these deserts, reptiles learned to adapt, while amphibians withdrew into the dwindling swamplands, their golden age fading as the Earth's surface itself betrayed them. Pangaea's creation also influenced the oceans. As the continents fused, shallow seas that had once covered vast areas disappeared, draining away ecosystems rich with life. The coastlines lengthened, but the variety of marine habitats shrank. With fewer shallow waters to support coral reefs and marine diversity, ocean ecosystems began to shift. Species that had depended on these environments were forced to adapt or vanish. Life, once scattered and abundant in many small seas, was now concentrated around the edges of one massive ocean. The Earth of Pangaea was a place of both grandeur and desolation. Towering mountains marked the scars of collisions, while endless deserts rolled across the interiors. Swamps that had once seemed eternal dwindled to pockets, leaving behind fossils of tree trunks buried in sandstone and the remains of animals that had failed to adapt. Yet out of this upheaval came opportunity. Reptiles, able to survive in dry habitats, rose in diversity and strength. Plants that could endure harsher conditions spread into lands where water was scarce. In this remade world of long coasts, rising mountains, and widening deserts, new winners emerged. Creatures that could shelter eggs on dry ground and hunt away from water spread across the interior, and among them, a sail-backed synapsid stepped into the open spaces of the Permian sunshine. On these hard soils and along these shrinking waterways, not a dinosaur would become the signature hunter of its age. As the great swamps receded and the land grew harsher under the shifting climate of Pangaea, new rulers stepped forward to claim the dry interior plains. The amphibians that had once dominated the wetlands were losing ground. Their soft eggs still tied them to water, their moist skin limiting them to humid environments. Reptiles and their kin, however, were free to spread further. They carried with them a key innovation, the amniotic egg, a tough, self-contained vessel that could survive away from lakes and rivers. This gave them the ability to thrive in the drier habitats that were spreading across the supercontinent. And among these land conquerors was a predator that would become one of the most recognizable icons of the Permian world, Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon is often mistaken for a dinosaur, its image gracing books, toys, and museum displays alongside long-necked sauropods and horned triceratops. Yet it lived more than 180 million years before the first dinosaurs ever walked the earth. It belonged not to the reptiles that would give rise to dinosaurs, but to the synapsids, an ancient lineage that would one day lead to mammals. Strange as it may seem, Dimetrodon was closer to us than to the creatures it is so often grouped with. Its body was an imposing sight. Dimetrodon stretched up to 12 feet in length, its muscular torso supported by strong, sprawling limbs that allowed it to move across rocky plains and dried riverbeds. Its head was massive, deep-set, and lined with teeth that revealed its role as a hunter. Unlike reptiles of the same era, its teeth came in different sizes and shapes, with sharp, serrated edges designed for tearing flesh. This arrangement, called heterodont dentition, is a trait that would later become a hallmark of mammals. With jaws that could deliver bone-crushing bites, Dimetrodon preyed on fish, amphibians, and smaller reptiles, ruling the ecosystems it inhabited. What made Dimetrodon unforgettable was the sail that rose from its back. Formed by elongated spines extending upward from its vertebrae, the sail was covered with skin, creating a great fan that could tower several feet above its body. For centuries, paleontologists have debated its function. Some believe it helped regulate body temperature, catching the morning sunrise to warm the animal quickly and releasing heat during the hotter parts of the day. Others suggest it was a display structure, a billboard of sorts, used to intimidate rivals, attract mates, or establish dominance. Whatever its true role, the sail gave Dimetrodon a silhouette unlike any other creature of its time, a living flag announcing the presence of an apex predator. Fossil evidence of Dimetrodon has been found in abundance, particularly in what is now North America and parts of Europe. These bones tell us not just about its form, but also about the world it inhabited. The Permian landscapes where Dimetrodon thrived were often dry, punctuated by seasonal rivers and small lakes. Vegetation was sparse compared to the lush forests of earlier times, with gymnosperms like conifers and seed ferns forming the dominant plant life. It was an environment where strength and adaptability were the keys to survival, and Dimetrodon embodied both. Imagine a Permian morning. The air is cooler than the heat of midday to come, and a Dimetrodon lies low near the edge of a riverbank. Its sail tilts toward the rising sunlight, absorbing warmth after the long chill of night. Nearby, smaller reptiles scurry between plants, and amphibians linger at the water's edge. The silence breaks with sudden violence as Dimetrodon lunges forward, its jaws snapping shut around a struggling prey. With powerful bites and teeth designed to shear through flesh, it reasserts its place as the ruler of its domain. Dimetrodon was not built for speed but for power. Its body carried the strength to overpower most animals of its time, and as an ambush predator, it did not need to chase its prey across long distances. Instead, it relied on stealth, patience, and the sudden strike of its jaws. In this way, it maintained its place at the very top of the food chain, an apex hunter of the Permian. Yet Dimetrodon's importance extends beyond its role as predator. It is a symbol of transition, a creature that bridges the gap between the reptile-like animals of the early Permian and the mammals that would one day dominate the Earth. Its differentiated teeth, its possible attempts at controlling body temperature, and its synapsid skull structure all point toward the path that would eventually lead to warm-blooded animals. In Dimetrodon, we see the earliest hints of features that are part of our own biology, carried within the body of a creature that lived nearly 300 million years ago. The Permian world was filled with such experiments in form and survival. Dimetrodon may have been the most iconic, but it was not alone. Other synapsids were evolving alongside it, some destined to become even more formidable hunters. Among them were the Gorgonopsids, predators with saber-like teeth that would rule the later Permian, shaping ecosystems in ways that foreshadowed the rise of future giants. The reign of Dimetrodon eventually faded as millions of years passed, and new predators emerged across the changing landscapes of the Permian. Life was still experimenting with form and function, and among the synapsids, another lineage began to rise, one that would take the role of apex hunter to an even sharper edge. These were the Gorgonopsids, fearsome creatures whose very name means Gorgon-faced, after the monstrous beings of Greek mythology. Their faces truly carried a terror all their own, framed by long saber-like teeth that jutted from their upper jaws. Gorgonopsids were mammal-like reptiles, members of the same broad synapsid family that would eventually give rise to mammals. Their skulls carried a single opening behind the eye socket, a trait that separated them from reptiles and linked them closer to us. But their bodies were built for the demands of their time. Many grew to lengths of more than 10 feet, with muscular frames and strong limbs that carried them across the dry plains and scrublands of late Permian Pangaea. Unlike the sprawling gait of Dimetrodon, Gorgonopsids had legs placed more directly beneath their bodies, giving them a more upright stance and greater agility. They were predators not of ambush alone, but of pursuit and precision. The most striking feature of Gorgonopsids was their elongated canines. Some species had saber teeth that stretched several inches long, designed to pierce deep into the flesh of their prey. These teeth were both weapons and symbols of dominance, a defining adaptation that allowed them to kill with speed and efficiency. Their jaws could open wide, and when they snapped shut, the saber-like canines punctured and tore, bringing down even large and struggling victims. Long before saber-toothed cats prowled the grasslands of the Cenozoic, Gorgonopsids had already tested the design. Their world was one of contrasts. The interior of Pangaea was dry, with deserts stretching far across its middle, but rivers, lakes, and seasonal wetlands carved out habitats where life gathered. Here, reptiles and smaller synapsids lived in abundance, and it was upon these that the Gorgonopsids preyed. Fossils show that their ecosystems were complex, with plant-eating synapsids like Dinosaurs forming herds that grazed on gymnosperm plants. These bulky, tusked creatures would have provided ample prey for the saber-toothed hunters that stalked them. The balance between predator and prey shaped the fabric of the Permian world, creating rhythms of survival that echoed through millions of years. The adaptations of Gorgonopsids suggest that they were active and powerful hunters. Their upright limbs allowed them to move faster than earlier sprawling synapsids. Their teeth were perfectly suited for delivering killing blows, and their skulls were light yet strong, enabling quick strikes. In some ways, they resembled a blend of reptilian body with mammalian efficiency, a glimpse of traits that would one day define future predators. Imagine the scene of a late Permian evening. A dicynodont herd gathers near a shallow lake, their tusked heads dipping toward the water. The air is dry, the vegetation sparse. From the shadows of the scrub, a Gorgonopsid emerges, its body low and deliberate, its saber teeth catching the last light of the sunset. With a sudden burst, it charges, jaws opening wide, canines flashing. Panic ripples through the herd as the predator singles out a victim. In the chaos, the Gorgonopsid lunges and bites, its saber teeth sinking deep, the struggle ending swiftly. This was the role of the apex predator in the late Permian: to strike, to shape the herds, to define the flow of life and death in a fragile and shifting world. The importance of Gorgonopsids goes beyond their fearsome appearance. They represent a stage in the long story of synapsids, a point where mammal-like traits were already being refined and tested. Their upright limbs, their efficient jaws, their specialized teeth all show the direction that evolution was taking. In them, we see early experiments in speed, in agility, in the precision of predation. They remind us that the line leading to mammals was once dominant, long before reptiles and dinosaurs rose to prominence. But the world they ruled was not stable. The late Permian carried with it signs of looming catastrophe. The continents were united into Pangaea, the climate was extreme, and ecosystems were already under stress. Even the most powerful hunters, with their saber-like teeth and commanding presence, were vulnerable to forces far greater than themselves. The stage was being set for one of the darkest moments in Earth's history, a crisis that would sweep across land and sea, bringing an end to nearly all life. For millions of years, the Gorgonopsids reigned as apex predators, their saber-like teeth glinting above the plains of the late Permian world. Herds of plant-eating synapsids roamed the land, forests of conifers and seed ferns stretched across the horizon, and reptiles spread into niches that amphibians could no longer claim. It was a world alive with balance, predator and prey shaping one another in cycles of survival. Yet deep beneath the surface, forces were gathering that would unravel this fragile equilibrium. The late Permian was drawing to a close, and with it, nearly all of life itself. The catastrophe that followed has been called the Great Dying, the most devastating extinction event in the history of the Earth. It unfolded around 252 million years ago and erased 90% of species in the oceans and more than 70% on land. No event before or since has come so close to silencing the story of life entirely. Fossil layers reveal the scale of the loss. Reefs vanished, forests collapsed, and predators like the Gorgonopsids disappeared forever. Entire lineages that had endured for hundreds of millions of years were gone in the span of a geological instant. The trigger of this disaster lay in fire. In what is now Siberia, one of the greatest volcanic events in Earth's history erupted with unimaginable force. For nearly 1,000,000 years, the Siberian traps spewed lava, covering millions of square miles in basalt. The scale was beyond comprehension, as rivers of molten rock poured across the land, burying valleys and mountains alike. But it was not the lava itself that caused the collapse of ecosystems. It was what the eruptions released into the air and the oceans. Vast quantities of carbon dioxide and methane spilled into the atmosphere. The greenhouse effect spiraled, raising global temperatures by several degrees. Seas grew warmer, and as the heat spread, the chemistry of the oceans shifted. Warmer waters hold less oxygen, and with the flood of carbon dioxide came widespread anoxia, suffocating marine life. The once rich oceans turned into dead zones where little could survive. Coral reefs, which had flourished for millions of years, were among the first to vanish, their delicate ecosystems crumbling under the twin stresses of heat and acidification. On land, the changes were equally brutal. Forests that had stretched across Pangaea withered as climates grew erratic and rainfall faltered. Drought spread across the interior, and vast deserts expanded even further. The collapse of plant life led to soil erosion, stripping the land bare. With food chains unraveling at the base, herbivores starved, and predators soon followed. The mighty Gorgonopsids, once apex hunters, found their prey dwindling, their numbers collapsing until none remained. Fossil evidence paints a bleak picture of these years. In marine sediments, layers rich in pyrite and other markers reveal lifeless oceans. On land, the fossil record thins dramatically, showing not only extinctions, but also a pause in the recovery of ecosystems. It was not simply that species disappeared, entire ways of life vanished. The Earth had been reshaped into a place where survival itself became a rare achievement. The emotional weight of the great dying is difficult to fathom. This was the closest life ever came to being erased from the planet. For every living lineage that continued, 9 others ended forever. The symphony of ecosystems that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build was silenced almost completely, leaving behind a barren and broken world. And yet, life did not vanish entirely. A small fraction of species endured, clinging to survival in refuges where conditions allowed. These survivors would inherit a world transformed, one where ecosystems had to rebuild from the ground up. The dominance of the great Permian synapsids was ended, but within the ruins, other creatures were already waiting, ready to take their place when the Earth began to heal. The great dying left behind a planet scarred and quiet, its oceans stripped of coral reefs, its forests reduced to barren stretches of land, its rivers and lakes emptied of the herds and hunters that once defined them. For millions of years, Earth had thrived with diversity, a tapestry woven from predators, prey, and towering plants. Now that tapestry was torn to threads, yet even in this silence, life clung on. Not in the form of mighty hunters like the Gorgonopsids, not in the lush forests of gymnosperms, but in creatures small, unassuming, and adaptable enough to endure the collapse. The fossil record of the early Triassic, the period that followed the Permian extinction, shows us a world dominated not by giants, but by survivors. Many of the great synapsids that had once ruled the land were gone, and those that remained were shadows of their former glory. Where Dimetrodon had stretched more than 10 feet long, their distant relatives shrank into smaller bodies, some no larger than a fox. These reduced forms could live on less food, reproduce more quickly, and squeeze into ecological niches left behind by larger animals that had vanished. In survival, size was not strength, flexibility was. Among these survivors were the therapsids, distant kin to mammals. Some evolved into small, burrowing forms, their lives spent in hidden tunnels where they were sheltered from the harsh heat and fluctuating climate of the early Triassic. By reducing their size and adapting to new diets, they managed to persist in environments where stability was rare. They no longer ruled as apex predators, but they endured, carrying forward the lineage that would one day blossom into mammals. Reptiles, too, found opportunity in the wreckage of ecosystems. Their hard-shelled eggs, able to withstand dry conditions, gave them a clear advantage in the arid landscapes that spread across Pangaea. With much of the competition erased, Reptiles diversified into forms both familiar and strange. Some became small insect eaters, quick and agile. Others took to the water, evolving into sleek swimmers that patrolled the rivers and shallow seas. Still others grew into early archosaurs, the ancestors of crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. From the fragile survivors of the extinction, the seeds of future dynasties were quietly being planted. The early Triassic landscape itself was harsh and unforgiving. Deserts sprawled across the interiors of Pangaea, while coastal areas were battered by seasonal storms and flooding. Temperatures swung to extremes, and oxygen levels in the atmosphere were lower than they had been before. Recovery was slow, and ecosystems remained unstable for millions of years. Yet, in the small bodies of reptiles and therapsids, in their ability to adapt, the story of life continued. Imagine the world in those first fragile years after the collapse. The land is bare, the forests thin, the air heavy and dry. Across a scrubby plain, a small synapsid darts between rocks, its body sleek and low to the ground. It digs into the soil, finding refuge from the midday heat. Nearby, a lizard-like reptile hunts insects, its quick movements breaking the silence of the plain. These are not the giants of the past, but they are enough. In their persistence lies the possibility of renewal. The loss of 90% of species was catastrophic, yet it also cleared the way for new forms to emerge. In the absence of competition, reptiles expanded into roles left empty. They became the hunters, the scavengers, the plant eaters, filling niches once occupied by larger synapsids. The ecosystems that rebuilt themselves were simpler at first, fragile and vulnerable to collapse, but they were a foundation from which diversity could return. The story of the fragile survivors reminds us that life is not always about dominance. It is about endurance. Those that survived the Great Dying were not necessarily the strongest or the fiercest, but the ones able to change, to fit into a harsher world, to make do with less. Their small bodies and adaptable ways carried them through one of the darkest chapters in Earth's history, and in time, they would give rise to some of the most extraordinary creatures the planet would ever know. And as the early Triassic world slowly stitched itself back together, new predators began to rise from among these survivors, shaping ecosystems in fresh and unexpected ways. The world that emerged after the Great Dying was almost unrecognizable. The vast majority of species had vanished, leaving behind landscapes that were eerily quiet compared to the bustling ecosystems of the Permian. The early Triassic began as a time of survival rather than abundance, and for millions of years, Earth struggled to recover. The scars of the extinction were carved into every environment, from the oceans to the deserts, and life was forced to adapt to a planet that was harsher, hotter, and more unstable than before. The climate of the early Triassic was unpredictable and extreme. With Pangaea still united as a single massive continent, much of its interior lay far from the cooling influence of the sea. This meant that temperatures soared during the day and plummeted at night, creating swings that tested even the hardiest creatures. Rainfall was scarce in the central deserts, yet violent storms battered the coastal edges of the supercontinent. These extremes shaped ecosystems into fragile systems, ones that could collapse at the slightest imbalance. The oceans, too, remained unstable. Anoxia still lingered in many places, leaving large regions devoid of oxygen and unable to support complex marine life. Recovery in the seas lagged behind that on land, with reefs slow to reappear and diversity remaining low for millions of years. It was as if the earth itself had taken a deep breath and had not yet exhaled, holding life in a state of fragile suspension. Yet even in this unstable world, new creatures began to rise. Among the most remarkable were the early archosaurs, a group of reptiles that would go on to produce crocodiles, pterosaurs, and eventually dinosaurs. In the early Triassic, they did not yet resemble the giants of later ages. Instead, many were small to medium-sized, moving with agility across dry plains and near shrinking rivers. Some had elongated bodies and narrow snouts, resembling strange crocodile-like ancestors. These early archosaurs were opportunists, filling ecological roles left empty by the collapse of older predators. Fossils reveal a variety of forms. Some were slender, lightly built hunters that chased after small reptiles and insects. Others grew larger, with stronger jaws and bodies suited for ambush near water, much like crocodiles of today. Their diversity speaks to their adaptability, a trait that would allow archosaurs to become some of the most successful animals in Earth's history. In the Triassic world, they were just beginning their long journey, carving out places in ecosystems that were still fragile and incomplete. The herbivores of this world were equally strange. Survivors of the extinction included small, tusked synapsids such as Lystrosaurus, which became one of the most common animals of the early Triassic. Fossil beds in South Africa and Antarctica reveal entire herds of these squat, beaked creatures, suggesting that they were resilient enough to thrive where many others had failed. Lystrosaurus filled the landscapes in staggering numbers, grazing on the sparse vegetation and forming the foundation of recovering food chains. Their success, however, was a reflection of the limited competition. Where once diversity had spread across countless species, now one creature dominated, a sign that ecosystems were still far from balanced. Imagine walking across a Triassic plain. The ground is cracked and dry, the horizon shimmering with heat. A herd of Lystrosaurus moves slowly across the dust, their beaked mouths scraping at low plants that cling stubbornly to the soil. Overhead, the sky shifts with dark clouds, promising a storm that will break the silence with sudden floods. From the edges of a dried riverbed, a crocodile-like archosaur waits, its narrow eyes locked on the herd. The world is rebuilding, but every encounter carries risk, every step balanced between survival and collapse. What makes the Triassic so extraordinary is not the richness of its ecosystems, but the determination of life to return. Slowly, over millions of years, species diversified, niches refilled, and food webs regained their complexity. The archosaurs grew stronger and more varied. The plant life expanded, and the oceans gradually recovered their stability. But in these early stages, the Earth was still a place of uncertainty, a planet testing its survivors against harsh new realities. As the Triassic world unfolded, the archosaurs would continue to push the boundaries of form and function, experimenting with ways of life that would shape the ages to come. Among these experiments were the first vertebrates to leave the ground behind entirely, creatures that spread their wings and took to the open skies. The Triassic world, though harsh and uncertain, was also an age of experimentation. Life that had survived the Great Dying was reshaping itself, adapting to new environments and exploring new ways of living. On land, archosaurs crept and hunted with forms that hinted at future crocodiles and dinosaurs. In the seas, reptiles began to swim like fish, filling niches left open by the collapse. And in the skies above, for the very first time, vertebrates broke free of the ground and conquered the air. These were the pterosaurs, the extraordinary pioneers of powered flight. For millions of years, the skies had belonged only to insects, dragonflies with wings as wide as a hawk's, and beetles that clattered through the air ruled these spaces without challenge. Birds did not yet exist, and bats were still far in the future. But in the late Triassic, Around 220 million years ago, the first pterosaurs appeared, their wings stretched taut over elongated fingers, their bodies lightened for flight. They were the first vertebrates to lift themselves into the open air on their own power, an innovation that would transform ecosystems forever. The anatomy of pterosaurs reveals just how radical this leap was. Their forelimbs were dramatically reshaped, with one finger extending far longer than the rest. A thin membrane of skin stretched from this finger back to the body, forming a wing capable of both lift and maneuverability. Unlike the stiff wings of insects, these membranes could flex and adjust, allowing pterosaurs to soar on air currents or beat their wings in steady flight. Their bones were hollow and lightweight, yet strong enough to support the stresses of flying. Their muscles were anchored to keeled breastbones, much like the birds that would follow, providing the power needed to sustain them in the skies. Early pterosaurs were not the massive giants, often pictured in later ages. Instead, they were modest in size, some no larger than a crow or gull, with narrow jaws and sharp teeth suited for snapping up insects or small prey. They lived along coastlines, lakes, and rivers, where food was plentiful and open skies provided room to maneuver. Their agility allowed them to escape predators on the ground, and their flight opened access to resources no other vertebrate had yet claimed. In this, they had carved out an entirely new dimension of life. The diversity of pterosaurs grew quickly. Some developed long, slender wings for gliding over open waters, catching fish with swift strikes. Others had shorter, broader wings for darting through inland habitats. Fossil evidence reveals crests on the heads of certain species, some small and simple, others large and elaborate, perhaps used for display or for stabilizing flight. These features hint at a richness of behavior, from courtship rituals to complex aerial strategies. Picture a Triassic shoreline as dusk falls. The water glimmers with the fading light, ripples spreading as small reptiles slip into the shallows. Above them, a new shape sweeps across the horizon. A pterosaur arcs gracefully, its wings catching the wind, its silhouette unlike anything else in the sky. With a sudden dip, it skims the water, jaws snapping at a darting fish, before rising again into the fading light. For the first time in Earth's long history, vertebrates were not bound to ground or water alone. They had claimed the air, and with it, a realm of endless possibility. The arrival of pterosaurs reshaped ecosystems. They introduced new predator-prey relationships, hunting insects, fish, and small reptiles. They also became prey themselves, vulnerable to archosaurs, and, later, to dinosaurs. Their ability to fly gave them an advantage, but it also bound them to the skies, where survival required constant adaptation. For millions of years, they would refine this innovation, eventually producing the giant flyers of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, some with wingspans longer than a small airplane. But in their earliest forms, they were already pioneers, pushing the boundaries of what life could achieve. The Triassic was a crucible of invention, and pterosaurs embodied its daring. From the heat and instability of a recovering planet, they rose on wings of skin and bone, carrying vertebrates into the skies for the very first time. And as they spread across coastlines and river deltas, another innovation was stirring in the same landscapes. On the ground below, small, swift reptiles were beginning to experiment with forms that would eventually dominate the land, just as pterosaurs had claimed the air. As pterosaurs tested the skies, reshaping the balance of ecosystems above the rivers and coasts, another quiet revolution was unfolding on the ground. In the dry plains and forests of the late Triassic, a new kind of reptile was beginning to emerge, one that would eventually define an entire era of Earth's history. These were the first dinosaurs, and though their beginnings were humble, their future would be extraordinary. Around 230 million years ago, small swift creatures like Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus appeared in what is now South America. Unlike the massive dinosaurs familiar to us today, these early forms were no larger than a medium-sized dog or at most a horse. Their bodies were built for agility rather than size. Eoraptor, for instance, was a lightly built hunter, just 3 feet long, with sharp teeth for nipping at small prey. Herrerasaurus was larger, reaching up to 10 feet, with longer legs and claws suited for capturing other reptiles. Both were fast, active, and adaptable, qualities that gave them an advantage in the unstable Triassic world. What set these animals apart from other reptiles of their time was the way they stood and moved. While many reptiles sprawled with limbs angled outward, early dinosaurs held their legs beneath their bodies, supporting them in a more upright posture. This meant they could move with greater efficiency, conserving energy and covering more ground. Their hips were shaped to allow this stance, marking a subtle but revolutionary shift in the way vertebrates walked. It was a design that would one day allow dinosaurs to grow into the giants of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, but in these early stages, it was a tool for speed and endurance. They did not dominate their world immediately. Instead, they competed with other reptile groups, including Rauisuchians, large crocodile-like predators that towered over them, and other archosaurs that filled many ecological roles. In these landscapes, early dinosaurs were not yet rulers but opportunists. They hunted insects, small reptiles, and amphibians, while scavenging when the opportunity arose. They were quick to exploit open niches, using their speed and agility to survive in environments where larger predators might struggle. The world they lived in was still marked by instability. The climate was hot and dry in many places, with monsoon rains flooding the lowlands and deserts stretching across much of Pangaea. Vegetation was dominated by hardy gymnosperms, ferns, and horsetails, plants that could endure the extremes of the Triassic. Herds of plant-eating reptiles like atosaurs and early relatives of crocodiles grazed across the plains, while amphibians lurked in the wetlands. Into this mix, the small dinosaurs slipped, fast-moving hunters and survivors that gradually carved out a role for themselves. Imagine a late Triassic floodplain after a heavy rain. The air is thick with humidity, the soil soft beneath shallow pools. A group of Herrerasaurus moves quickly across the plain, their tails stretched out for balance, their legs carrying them in smooth strides. Ahead, a smaller Eoraptor darts between plants, pausing to snap at an insect. In the distance, a Rauisuchian stalks, its towering body a reminder of the dangers that still dominated the land. Yet despite their size, these early dinosaurs endure, their agility allowing them to evade, to persist, and to find a place in a competitive world. The significance of these first dinosaurs lies not in their size but in their potential. They were experiments in form and function, combining speed, upright posture, and adaptability in ways that set them apart from their rivals. Over millions of years, these traits would prove invaluable. As extinctions cleared away the competition, the descendants of Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus would expand into new shapes and sizes, filling niches from towering plant eaters to colossal predators. The giants we so often imagine, the long-necked sauropods, the horned ceratopsians, the mighty tyrannosaurs, all trace their origins back to these small, swift pioneers. The late Triassic was a proving ground. Life was still fragile, still rebuilding after the devastation of the Great Dying. But within its shifting landscapes, These early dinosaurs planted the roots of a dynasty that would stretch for more than 160 million years. And as they found their footing on land, other archosaurs continued to prowl, some growing into formidable predators that rivaled and even overshadowed the early dinosaurs. The first dinosaurs, swift and agile, were not born into a world they ruled. For all their innovation and speed, they lived in the shadow of other predators that already held dominance over the Triassic landscapes. These were the Rauisuchians and their kin, immense crocodile-like reptiles that walked the earth long before their smaller dinosaur cousins rose to power. They are little known today, often forgotten in the grand story of life. Yet in their time, they were the true apex hunters, shaping ecosystems with their towering presence. Rauisuchians were part of the archosaur family, the same great lineage that produced crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. But unlike the squat, water-loving crocodiles of the modern world, many Rauisuchians were giants of the dry land. Some species grew more than 20 feet long, their bodies held high above the ground by legs placed directly beneath them. This upright stance allowed them to move with a stride that was surprisingly efficient, closer to the posture of mammals and dinosaurs than the sprawling gait of lizards. Their bodies were built for power, their skulls broad and lined with serrated teeth designed to pierce and tear through flesh. Fossil evidence paints them as formidable hunters. They stalked floodplains, forests, and deserts, preying upon anything within reach. Plant-eating reptiles such as atosaurs, armored with bony plates, and the squat herds of Lystrosaurus were all potential meals. Even the early dinosaurs, swift as they were, had to be wary of these reptilian overlords. In a world still recovering from the devastation of the Great Dying, Rauisuchians set the tone for survival. They were the figures that dictated balance, keeping populations in check and ensuring that the fragile ecosystems of the Triassic did not become overwhelmed by herbivores. Imagine a Triassic floodplain, greened for a season by monsoon rains. Small dinosaurs dart through the undergrowth, their tails lifted for balance, their heads turning at every sound. From the tree line emerges a Rauisuchian, its bulk blotting out the horizon, each step sending vibrations through the soil, its jaws open, revealing a forest of serrated teeth. A single lunge is enough to scatter the smaller reptiles, their speed the only defense against its power. To witness such a scene would have been to see a reminder that dinosaurs did not begin as rulers, but as survivors, finding places at the edges of a world still owned by these reptilian titans. Rauisuchians were not the only crocodile-like hunters to dominate the Triassic. Their relatives included phytosaurs, long-snouted reptiles that resembled crocodiles so closely that for years they were mistaken for them. But unlike modern crocodiles, phytosaurs carried their nostrils high on their heads, just in front of their eyes, an adaptation that let them lurk at the surface of the water with jaws ready to strike. They patrolled lakes and rivers, ambushing fish and unsuspecting land animals that came to drink. In the shadows of wetlands and riversides, they were as fearsome as Rauisuchians were on the plains. Together, these crocodile-like predators created a world where power came not from novelty, but from size and specialization. Dinosaurs in these early times remained relatively small, opportunists darting around the giants, taking advantage of what scraps they could. The dominance of Rauisuchians shows us how evolutionary success is not always about being first in line for the future. For tens of millions of years, they thrived as the rulers of their ecosystems, living lives every bit as successful as the dinosaurs that would eventually replace them. The reign of these predators, however, was not permanent. The Triassic was an age of instability, its climate swinging from drought to storm, its continents reshaping under the slow grind of tectonics. As time passed, the Rauisuchians began to dwindle. Their dominance was fragile, dependent on conditions that were shifting beneath their feet. And as the boundary between the Triassic and Jurassic approached, the Earth itself prepared to sweep the stage once more with extinction, an event that would strip away the great reptilian hunters and leave the field open for the dinosaurs waiting in their shadow. The Triassic had been a time of invention, a long and uneasy recovery from the scars of the Great Dying. Life had tested new forms, from crocodile-like Rauisuchians that stalked the land to slender pterosaurs that slipped into the skies, and to the first small dinosaurs that darted between them. Ecosystems were fragile but diverse, a patchwork stitched together after catastrophe, yet stability was never permanent in deep time. At the boundary between the Triassic and the Jurassic, another great extinction struck, one that would once again tear apart the balance of life and clear the way for the rise of new rulers. This extinction unfolded around 201 million years ago. Though it was not as devastating as the end Permian event, it was powerful enough to erase entire lineages and transform the trajectory of evolution. Many of the great crocodile-line predators, including the towering Rauisuchians that had overshadowed early dinosaurs, disappeared. Amphibians that had clung to survival in specialized habitats also dwindled, and the diversity of marine life collapsed in several regions. What caused this sudden unraveling has been the subject of decades of study, but the clues lie in the restless movements of the Earth itself. As Pangaea continued to stretch and split, the first rifts began to open between what would eventually become the Atlantic Ocean. Along these rifts, volcanic activity surged, releasing immense quantities of lava that spread in thick flows across the land. Known today as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, this event represents one of the largest volcanic outpourings in Earth's history. With the lava came enormous volumes of carbon dioxide and other gases, which flooded the atmosphere and sent the climate into chaos. Global temperatures climbed sharply, seasons became unstable, and ocean chemistry shifted. Warmer waters reduced oxygen in the seas, leading to anoxic events that suffocated marine species. On land, the rapid warming placed stress on plants and the herbivores that depended on them, which in turn starved the predators. It was a cascade of collapses, rippling outward from the changes in climate triggered by the massive eruptions. Imagine standing in a Triassic forest as this shift took hold. The ground rumbles with distant tremors, the air thick with a faint haze that clings to the horizon. Days grow hotter, storms less predictable, and the once familiar rhythm of the seasons begins to falter. In rivers and wetlands, amphibians vanish, unable to endure the extremes. On the plains, the great Rauisuchians that once ruled are nowhere to be seen, their dominance broken by scarcity. The ecosystems that had seemed stable crumble, leaving behind an emptiness in the chain of life. Into this emptiness stepped the dinosaurs. Small though they had been in the Triassic, their upright stance, efficient movement, and adaptability gave them the tools to seize the spaces left behind. While Rauisuchians collapsed, dinosaurs endured, and as the extinction cleared away their rivals, they expanded into new niches. Plant-eating dinosaurs grew larger, forming the first herds that grazed across Jurassic landscapes. Predatory dinosaurs diversified, taking over roles once filled by crocodile-line hunters. It was not that dinosaurs were destined to rise, but that circumstance and survival favored them in this moment of crisis. The Triassic-Jurassic boundary marks one of the great turning points in Earth's story. It was the threshold that allowed dinosaurs to shift from small, swift survivors into the dominant animals of the land. In the centuries and millennia that followed the extinction, ecosystems slowly rebuilt, but this time dinosaurs stood at their center. Their reign would stretch unbroken for more than 160 million years, shaping the planet in ways no other group of animals had before. And as these early dinosaurs spread into their new roles, carrying the legacy of resilience and opportunity, they inherited a world reshaped not just by extinction, but by possibility. The stage was set for the true age of dinosaurs to begin, built on the lessons of those that had come before. The world that opened after the Triassic-Jurassic extinction seemed new, but the creatures that inherited it carried with them the weight of an ancient past. Dinosaurs did not appear in a vacuum. Their rise was built on the experiments of countless generations of animals that had come before, from the first vertebrates that dared to step onto land to the predators and plant eaters that tested life's limits in the Permian and Triassic. Every stride a dinosaur took, every trait that helped them thrive, was a gift from forgotten giants and humble survivors. One of the most important legacies came from the amphibians that had first crawled out of the water. With them arrived the lungs that could draw oxygen from the air, freeing vertebrates from a dependence on gills. Their strong, jointed limbs allowed movement across mudflats and swamps, paving the way for the upright legs that dinosaurs would later perfect. Even though amphibians remained tied to damp environments, their early steps laid the foundation for reptiles and eventually for dinosaurs to roam freely across drier lands. From reptiles, dinosaurs inherited the innovation of the amniotic egg. Encased in a protective shell, these eggs could survive far from water, nourishing the embryo with its own self-contained supply of food and moisture. This single adaptation was revolutionary, opening the possibility of life spreading across vast deserts and plains where amphibians could never venture. The ability to reproduce in so many environments gave reptiles an unmatched versatility, one that dinosaurs carried forward as they spread across the globe. Other gifts were less obvious but equally important. In the Carboniferous and Permian, arthropods and amphibians had shown the power of giantism when conditions allowed, but their size often made them vulnerable to changing climates. From this, evolution pressed another lesson into the lineages that followed. Efficiency was as important as power. Dinosaurs carried this lesson in their bones, developing lightweight but strong skeletons that could support great size without sacrificing mobility. Their hollow bones echoed innovations that had roots deep in reptilian ancestry, refined over time into the forms that would allow pterosaurs to soar and sauropods to grow taller than trees. The Permian synapsids, though distant kin to mammals rather than dinosaurs, also shaped the story. From them came the refinement of differentiated teeth, powerful jaws, and upright gaits. These features showed the potential of specialized hunting and efficient locomotion. Dinosaurs borrowed the principle of upright stance, placing their legs beneath their bodies rather than sprawling outward like lizards. This posture allowed them to conserve energy, run faster, and support heavier bodies, advantages that would one day help them grow into the towering herbivores and swift predators of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. The Triassic itself was a testing ground. The crocodile-line predators, with their upright limbs and serrated teeth, revealed how effective such traits could be. Dinosaurs coexisted with these powerful rivals, honing their own adaptations in the shadows of Rauisuchians and phytosaurs. Competing against them forced early dinosaurs to refine their agility, their speed, and their ability to survive in harsh conditions. When the extinction swept those rivals away, Dinosaurs were ready to seize the opportunity, already carrying the traits they had sharpened during millions of years of competition. Even plants had a role in shaping their destiny. The rise of gymnosperms, with their tough seeds and needle-like leaves, created new challenges for herbivores. Dinosaurs evolved teeth and digestive systems capable of processing fibrous plants, building on the work of earlier reptiles that had experimented with herbivory. The very structure of the forests and plains influenced the evolution of the animals that fed within them, and in turn, the predators that hunted them. Picture a Jurassic plain after the extinction. A small group of early dinosaurs grazes on low shrubs, their legs steady beneath them, their tails balancing each stride. Nearby, another dinosaur watches, sleek and alert, its muscles ready to spring. These creatures were shaped not just by the present moment, but by countless ages of trial and error before them. Each breath they took carried the legacy of the first amphibians. Each egg they laid was the gift of ancient reptiles. Each step they took was balanced by lessons from predators long extinct. Dinosaurs may seem like the beginning of something entirely new, but in truth, they were the culmination of everything that came before. They were the heirs of survivors, the beneficiaries of experiments carried out over hundreds of millions of years. And in their success, they revealed the deep truth of life's story, that every age shapes the next, and even in extinction, nothing is entirely lost. As dinosaurs spread across the Jurassic landscapes, filling roles once held by forgotten hunters and herbivores, the world itself began to take on a new rhythm. Their rise was not just a moment of dominance, but a continuation of a lineage shaped by ancient resilience. And within this new order lay lessons in survival that would echo far into the future. The rise of dinosaurs was not simply a matter of power or destiny. It was the result of lessons written deep into the history of life, carried forward from survivors that had endured catastrophe after catastrophe. Extinction events, as devastating as they were, acted as turning points, reshaping the direction of evolution. Time and again, they cleared away the dominant forms and opened space for others waiting in the shadows. It was through these cycles of destruction and renewal that adaptability revealed itself as the true key to survival. Every great extinction had left its mark. The first mass die-off in the Ordovician tested the resilience of ocean life, forcing survivors to rebuild new reefs and ecosystems from the ruins. The Devonian extinction cleared away armored fish, giving rise to early amphibians that ventured onto land. The Permian extinction, the Great Dying, nearly erased life altogether, but those that endured became the foundation of the Triassic world. And at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, when Rauisuchians and other crocodile-line predators vanished, dinosaurs stepped forward into the empty roles. Each collapse was a tragedy, but also a moment of creation, forcing evolution to explore paths that otherwise might never have been taken. The survivors of these extinctions were rarely the largest or most fearsome. They were often small, adaptable creatures that could live on little, change their habits, or occupy niches overlooked by others. Lystrosaurus, a squat tusk synapsid, became one of the most common animals after the Great Dying, simply because it could endure harsh climates and live on sparse vegetation. Insects persisted through every collapse, their diversity and short life cycles allowing them to adapt quickly to shifting environments. Reptiles with hard-shelled eggs had an advantage over amphibians when conditions grew dry, allowing them to spread where others could not. Over and over, survival came not from strength, but from flexibility. Dinosaurs themselves inherited this lesson. In their earliest days, they were small and unremarkable compared to the towering predators of the Triassic. Yet their upright stance made them efficient. Their bodies were light but strong, and their habits were varied enough to let them persist where others failed. When extinction struck at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, it was this adaptability that allowed them to expand into the spaces left behind. From there, they diversified into forms as different as the long-necked sauropods and the swift predatory theropods, proving that the capacity to change was the foundation of their dominance. Imagine the story as a rhythm. Each extinction is a pause, a sudden silence in the symphony of life. What follows is not a repeat of the same melody, but a new variation built on what survived the silence. Without those breaks, without those devastating moments, the great experiments of evolution might never have occurred. The forests of the Carboniferous, the reign of amphibians, the rise of synapsids, the triumph of dinosaurs, all were shaped by the forces of collapse and renewal. This lesson carries an emotional weight because it reveals that life has never been about permanence. Dominance is temporary, no matter how secure it may seem. What endures is adaptability, the ability to find a way in a world that never stops changing. The survivors of ancient extinctions remind us that resilience lies not in resisting change, but in bending with it, finding new ways to endure when the old ways fail. As the Jurassic Age opened, dinosaurs embodied this principle, stepping into a world transformed by loss, yet rich with opportunity. Their success was not inevitable, but born from the deep lessons carried forward by the countless survivors before them. And while dinosaurs spread across plains, forests, and coasts, echoes of those earlier ages still lingered, living fossils that whispered of the giants and survivors of Earth's forgotten past. Even as dinosaurs spread across the Jurassic world, filling landscapes with new shapes and sounds, there were quiet survivors that carried with them the memory of ages long past. These were not the mighty rulers of their time, but the quiet echoes of lineages that had endured for hundreds of millions of years. To see them today is to glimpse not just the present, but fragments of worlds that once were, worlds where trilobites scuttled across Cambrian seas and dragonflies cast shadows like birds over Carboniferous swamps. One of the most striking of these living echoes is the horseshoe crab. Though not true crabs at all, they are among the most ancient creatures alive today. Their lineage stretches back more than 450 million years, long before the first dinosaurs or even the first forests. Their domed shells and long tails are reminders of the trilobites that once thrived in Earth's early oceans, scuttling across seafloors in vast numbers. Trilobites vanished at the end of the Permian, but horseshoe crabs persisted, carrying forward a body plan so effective it has needed little change. On modern shores, they still come in their thousands during high tides, gathering to lay eggs in the sand. Their blue blood, rich in copper instead of iron, clots in the presence of bacteria, a defense so effective that it has even become valuable for human medicine. Watching them move across beaches today is to see a living fragment of prehistory, an animal whose ancestors endured extinctions that erased nearly everything else around them. Dragonflies, too, are reminders of a time when the air itself shaped monsters. In the Carboniferous, the atmosphere carried 35% oxygen compared to the 21% we breathe now. That single difference allowed insects to grow to astonishing sizes. Dragonflies of that age, such as Meganeura, stretched wings wider than a hawk's, their bodies darting through swamp forests as apex aerial hunters. They would have cast shadows across the ferns below, their compound eyes scanning for prey with uncanny precision. The dragonflies of today are smaller, limited by modern oxygen levels, yet they still carry the same ancient design. Their wings beat with a precision unmatched by any other insect, allowing them to hover, dart, and even fly backward. Their eyes are mosaics of thousands of lenses, reading the world in ways far beyond our own vision. When one glides across a pond in the summer light, it is more than a fleeting moment of beauty. It is an echo of a time when skies hummed with giants. Millipedes tell a similar story. In the Carboniferous, the monstrous Arthropleura stretched longer than a car, armored in heavy plates, its hundreds of legs moving in rippling waves as it scuttled across forest floors. It was the largest land invertebrate to ever exist, a creature that made even the bravest reptiles seem small. Today, millipedes are far reduced in scale, curling quietly under logs, feeding on decaying plant matter. Yet their segmented bodies and endless legs still whisper of their gigantic ancestor, a creature that once ruled the land long before dinosaurs walked it. These living echoes are more than curiosities. They are proof of resilience. Horseshoe crabs, dragonflies, and millipedes remind us that evolution is not always about becoming something new. Sometimes it is about finding a form so effective, so enduring, that it survives nearly unchanged across unimaginable spans of time. They connect the present to a chain of history stretching back to oceans and forests that no longer exist. Imagine walking along a quiet shoreline at dusk, where horseshoe crabs cluster in the tide, their shells gleaming in the fading light. Above, a dragonfly hovers, its wings catching the air with ancient precision. Beneath a fallen log, a millipede coils slowly through the damp earth. These creatures seem ordinary at first glance, yet each carries within it the memory of forgotten worlds, survivors of catastrophes that erased nearly everything else. The echoes of prehistoric giants are not confined to fossils locked in stone. They are alive around us, if only we look closely. And as we see them, we are reminded that the story of life is not just about dominance or extinction. It is about endurance, about the quiet persistence of forms that work, carrying the past into the present and shaping the world that will come next. The story of Earth's ancient past is not only about creatures long gone, it is also a mirror held up to us, reflecting patterns of fragility and resilience that continue to shape the planet today. Each extinction, each collapse of climate and ecosystem reminds us that life is balanced on delicate threads. And yet, every recovery, every survivor that endures against impossible odds shows us the astonishing power of adaptation. In the rise and fall of ancient worlds, we find lessons that matter deeply for our own time. The Carboniferous forests that once towered over swampy ground were transformed into coal seams after shifts in climate and sea level pulled their roots from stability. The Devonian seas, rich with armored fish, turned anoxic as oxygen disappeared from the water, suffocating entire ecosystems. The Permian world, once thriving with synapsids and lush forests, collapsed under the weight of volcanic eruptions, rising carbon dioxide, and a climate that grew too extreme for most species to bear. These were not slow changes alone, stretching across eons. Some were sudden and sharp, unfolding over thousands of years, a blink compared to the age of the earth. For the creatures living in those times, the world they knew could vanish within the span of a few generations. When we study these deep histories, it is hard not to hear echoes in our present. Today, the earth is warming again, this time driven not by volcanic eruptions, but by human industry. Carbon dioxide levels rise, oceans warm and lose oxygen, storms grow stronger, and species vanish at alarming rates. The patterns are familiar: for they have played out before. The difference is that now we are not only witnesses, but participants. The fragility of life revealed in these ancient events is sobering. Species that seemed unshakable, like the mighty Gorgonopsids of the Permian or the sprawling swamp forests of the Carboniferous, could disappear when conditions shifted beyond their limits. Dominance offered no guarantee of survival. The largest, the fiercest, the most numerous none were safe when the climate turned against them. That fragility is a reminder that even in our modern age, no creature, not even humans, is separate from the systems that sustain life. Yet there is another lesson intertwined with fragility, one of resilience. Time and again, life has found a way forward. Horseshoe crabs survived the collapse of trilobites. Small synapsids endured when their larger kin vanished. Early reptiles rose in the aftermath of disaster and gave rise to dinosaurs. Every extinction cleared the slate, and every survivor wrote the next chapter. This resilience shows that adaptability is the true strength of life, a strength measured not in size or power, but in the ability to bend, to change, and to endure. For us, these twin lessons are deeply relevant. The fragility of ecosystems warns us of the consequences of disrupting the balance too quickly, while the resilience of survivors reminds us that recovery is possible if life is given the chance. The Earth has lived through upheaval before, but recovery after collapse often takes millions of years. For humans, whose history is measured in only tens of thousands of years, that timescale is far beyond our patience. The challenge of our time is not only to survive the changes we have set in motion, but to soften them, to leave space for resilience to work before collapse becomes too deep. Picture a shoreline where a horseshoe crab crawls out of the waves to lay its eggs, just as its ancestors did hundreds of millions of years ago. Above it, a dragonfly hovers, its wings catching the light in the same way its giant kin once did in ancient forests. These small, ordinary moments are not just relics of the past, but threads that connect us to deep time. They remind us that we are part of this ongoing story, inheritors of both fragility and resilience. As we look to the future, the story of Earth's ancient collapses matters because it shows us both the danger of ignoring change and the hope of adaptation. Life has always found a way to continue, but the form it takes is never guaranteed. In the choices we make now, we decide what the echoes of our age will sound like millions of years from today. The story of life on Earth is a story of cycles. Time stretches so far behind us that it is difficult to grasp, yet in its rhythms we can find a strange kind of calm. Worlds have risen, flourished, and fallen, only for new ones to emerge from their remains. Oceans have spread and retreated, mountains have risen and crumbled, and entire dynasties of creatures have come and gone. In the span of hundreds of millions of years, destruction and renewal are not exceptions, but the natural heartbeat of the planet. When we look back across these immense ages, we see that nothing has been permanent, not even the rulers that once seemed unstoppable. Trilobites filled ancient seas for nearly 300 million years, then vanished. The forests of the Carboniferous, lush and endless, collapsed into swamps and coal beds. The mighty synapsids of the Permian, creatures that once strode as lords of their ecosystems, were cut down by extinction, leaving only fragile survivors behind. Even the dinosaurs, whose reign stretched longer than the entire history of mammals, met an end they could not escape. Each chapter closes, but each chapter also opens into something new. To think in this way is to step outside the scale of our own lives. Our history as a species is recent, measured not in millions of years, but in tens of thousands. Even the oldest civilizations we know are only a few thousand years old. barely a blink in comparison to the age of trilobites or the forests of the Carboniferous. Our moment is not the grand arc of the story, but a breath, a fleeting note in a symphony that has been playing for billions of years. There is something both humbling and comforting in this. Humbling because it reminds us that the earth does not revolve around us, that its story would continue with or without our presence. Comforting because it shows us that the world has endured so much already, and that change, even when it feels overwhelming, is part of its very nature. Picture the earth not as it is now, but as a shifting mosaic of all the forms it has taken. Imagine oceans teeming with trilobites, forests humming with giant dragonflies, plains thundered across by sauropods, and ice sheets stretching to the horizon. Each image is real, each one a moment in time, layered together like the pages of a book. To stand in the present is to stand on top of all those pages, carried by them, shaped by them, connected to them in ways we often forget. When we trace this deep history, we begin to see that survival has never been about resisting change. It has been about flowing with it, bending and adapting as the planet shifts. Fragility and resilience are not opposites, but companions, each shaping the path of life in its own way. In this sense, our moment is not isolated, but part of the same unfolding story, a continuation of the cycles that have always defined Earth. As we reflect on this, there is a quiet wonder in recognizing that we, too, are part of deep time. The atoms in our bodies were forged in stars long before the Earth existed. The oxygen we breathe comes from plants that transformed the planet's air hundreds of millions of years ago. The bones in our skeletons carry echoes of ancient fish that first stepped onto land. We are not separate from this history, we are its latest chapter, written into its continuity. And so, as the story carries forward, we stand at a delicate point in time. Our choices matter, but the broader truth remains. The earth has endured countless upheavals, and it will endure countless more. Our presence is brief, yet within that brevity lies the chance to listen, to learn, and to leave our own mark, one that may echo far into the future. From this perspective, deep time becomes less a burden and more a kind of gentle reassurance. The planet has lived many lives before us, and it will live many more after. We are but a breath in its long story, yet within that breath, we are connected to everything that has ever been. The story we have traveled through together is not only the story of dinosaurs, but of everything that came before them, long before the thunder of sauropod herds or the roar of tyrannosaurs. The earth was already alive with wonders so strange that they make the age of dinosaurs seem almost familiar. The world of giant dragonflies with wings as wide as hawks, of millipedes longer than cars, of amphibians that hunted like crocodiles, of armored fish that swam like tanks through Devonian seas, and of saber-toothed Gorgonopsids that stalked the Permian plains. These were not myths, not inventions, but the true rulers of forgotten worlds. To imagine them is to step into landscapes that feel both alien and familiar. Vast forests once towered over swampy ground, humming with life, shaped by air, thick with oxygen. Oceans brimmed with trilobites, their crystal eyes scanning ancient reefs. Strange predators like Anomalocaris, with hooked arms and rotating mouths, drifted through Cambrian waters that no human eye has ever seen. Each age carried its own cast of characters, its own experiments in form and survival, only to be swept away when the earth turned its page. And each time, life returned, reshaped, carrying forward the lessons of what came before. Dinosaurs would one day inherit this legacy, but their story was built on the foundations of these forgotten giants. Every breath they took, every step they made, was possible because earlier creatures had already tested the limits of air, water, and land. The towering reptiles of the Jurassic and Cretaceous were heirs, not beginnings, and when they too vanished, their legacy lived on in the birds that still grace our skies. It is easy to see the age of dinosaurs as the great chapter of Earth's history, yet when we look deeper, we discover that the chapters before it are just as compelling, filled with life that seems more fantastic than anything our imagination could conjure. To remember these forgotten worlds is to recognize the vastness of time, the depth of change, and the strange, unbroken continuity of life. As this story draws gently to a close, I would like to invite you, if you have found wonder in these ancient worlds, to let the algorithm know that sleep and science truly belong together. A gentle like, a quiet subscribe, or even sharing where you are listening from in the comments helps this small corner of curiosity reach more people who may be searching for both calm and discovery. It is always a joy to see this community stretch across time zones and continents, all gathered beneath the same endless story of the Earth. And so we return to the emotional heart of it all, the truth that our planet has lived many lives before us. It has been an ocean world, an ice world, a swamp world, and a world of giants. It has hosted creatures that seem too strange to believe, yet their fossils rest beneath our feet, telling us that they were real. The Earth has endured countless cycles of loss and renewal, and in each one, life has found a way to continue. Picture the silence of a Carboniferous forest, broken only by the slow beat of enormous wings. Imagine the depths of a Devonian sea, where armored fish glide past like living fortresses. Think of the Permian plains, where saber-toothed hunters prowl under a red sunlight. These worlds are gone, yet their echoes remain in fossils, in living survivors, and in the very structure of the life that surrounds us today. And so, as the story pauses here, remember this gentle truth. Our world has lived many lives before us, and it will live many more after. We are but a breath in its long history, yet even in that breath, we are part of something vast and enduring.